Chapter 30 of Harriet's Choice. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Harriet's Choice by Rosa Nouchette Carey. Chapter 30. I cannot sing the old songs. Ask me no more, what answer should I give? I love not hollow cheek or faded eye, yet, O my friend, I will not have thee die. Ask me no more, lest I should bid thee live. Ask me no more. Ask me no more, thy fate and mine are sealed. I strove against the stream, and all in vain. Let the great river take me to the main. No more, dear love, for at a touch I yield. Ask me no more. Tennyson's Princess. Richard had promised to pay them another visit shortly, and one Saturday evening, while Polly and Sue were racing each other among the gravel pits and the furze bushes of the People's Great Common, and the lights twinkled merrily in the Vale of Health, and the shifting mist shut out the blue distances of Harrow and Pinner, Mildred was charmed as well as startled by the sound of his voice in the hall. Well, Rex, you are getting on famously, I hear, thanks to Aunt Millie's nursing, was his cheerful greeting. Roy shook his head despondingly. I should do better if I could see something different from these four walls, he returned with a discontented glance round the room that Mildred had made so bright and pretty. It is absurd keeping me moped up here, but Aunt Millie is inexorable. Mildred smiled over her boy's peevishness. He does not know what is good for him, she returned gently. He always gets restless towards evening. Dr. Blenkinsop has been most strict in bidding me keep him from excitement and not to let him talk with anyone. This is the first day he has withdrawn his prohibition, and Roy has been in his tantrums ever since. He said I might go downstairs if only I were spared the trouble of walking, grumbled Roy, who sometimes tyrannized over Aunt Millie, and dearly she loved such tyranny. He is more like a spoiled child than ever, she said, laughing. If that be all, the difficulty is soon obviated. I can carry him easily, returned Richard, looking down a little sadly at the long gaunt figure before him, looking strangely shrunken in the brilliant dressing-gown that was Roy's special glory. But I must be careful. You look thin and brittle enough to break. May he, Aunt Millie? Oh, I do so long to see the old studio again, and the couch is so much more comfortable than this, his eyes beginning to shine with excitement, and his color varying dangerously. Is it quite prudent, Richard? She asked hesitatingly. Had we not better wait till tomorrow? But Roy's eagerness overbore her scruples. Polly little knew what surprise was in store for her. Her race over, she walked along soberly, wondering how she should occupy herself that evening. She, too, knew that Dr. Blenkinsop's prohibition had been removed, and had chafed a little restlessly when Mildred had asked her to be patient till the next day. Aunt Millie is too careful. She does not think how I long to see him, she said, as she walked slowly home. A light streamed across the dark garden when she reached the hollies, a radiance of firelight and lamplight. I wonder if Richard has come, thought Polly, as she stole into the little passage and gently opened the door. Yes, Richard was there, his square, thick-set figure blocking up the fireplace as he leant in his favorite attitude against the mantelpiece, and there was Aunt Millie, smiling as though something pleased her, and yes, surely that was Roy's wraith, wrapped in the gorgeous dressing-gown and supported by pillows. The blood rushed to the girl's face as she stood for a moment, as though spellbound, but at the sound of her half-suppressed exclamation, he turned his head feebly and looked at her. Polly, was all he said, but at his voice she had sprung across the room, and as he stretched out his thin hand to her with an attempt at his old smile, a low sob had risen to her lips and utterly overcome by the spectacle of his weakness, she buried her face in his pillows. Roy's eyes grew moist with sympathy. "Don't cry, Polly, don't. I cannot bear it," he whispered faintly. "Don't, Polly, try to control yourself. This agitation is very bad for him," and Richard raised her gently, for a deadly pallor had overspread Roy's features. "I could not help it," she returned, drying her eyes. "Do see him lying there looking so ill. Oh, Rex, it breaks my heart." And the two young creatures almost clung together in their agitation, and indeed Roy's hollow blue eyes and thin, bloodless face had a spectral beauty that was absolutely startling. "I never thought you would mind so much, Polly," he said tremulously, and the poor lad looked at her with an eagerness that he could not disguise. "I hardly dared to expect that you could waste so much time and thought on me." "Oh, Rex, how can you say such unkind things? Not care, and I have been fretting all this time." "That was hardly kind to Harriet, was it?" he said, watching her, and a strange, vivid light shone in his eyes. If she had not known before, she must have felt then how he loved her. A sudden blush rose to her cheek as he mentioned Dr. Harriot's name. Involuntarily she moved a little away from him, and Roy's head fell back on the pillow with a sigh. Neither of them seemed much disposed for speech after that. Roy lay back with closed eyes and knitted brows, and Polly sat on a low chair watching the great spluttering log and showers of sparks, while Mildred and Richard talked in undertones. Now and then Roy opened his eyes and looked at her, at the dainty little figure and sweet, thoughtful face. The firelight shone on the shielding hand and half-hoop of diamonds. He recognized the ribbon she wore. He had bought it for her, as well as the little garnet ring he had afterwards voted as rubbish. The sight angered him. He would claim it again, he thought. She should wear no gifts of his. The diamonds had overpowered his garnets, just as his poor little love had been crushed by Dr. Harriot's fascination. Adonis, with his sleepy blue eyes and fair mustache and velvet coat, had failed in the contest with the elder man. What was he, after all, but a beggarly artist? No wonder she despised his scraps of ribbon, his paltry gewgaws and odds and ends of rubbish. And yet if I had only had my chance, he groaned within himself, if I had wooed her, if I had compelled her to understand my meaning. And then his anger melted as she raised her clear, honest eyes and looked at him. "Are you in pain, Rex? Can I move your pillows?" Bending over him rather timidly. Poor children, a veil of reserve had fallen between them since Dr. Harriot's name had been mentioned, and she no longer spoke to him with the old fearlessness. "No, I'm not in pain. Come here, Polly, you have not begun to be afraid of me since I've been ill," rather moodily. "No, Rex, of course not," but she faltered a little over her words. "Sit down beside me for a minute. What was it you called me in your letter before I was ill? Something, it looked strangely written by your hand, Polly." "Brother, my dear brother Rex," almost inaudibly. "Ah, I remember. It would have made me smile, only I was not in the humor for smiling. I did not write back to my sister, Polly, though. Richard calls you his little sister very often, does he not?" "Yes, and I love to hear him say it, very earnestly." "Should you love it if I called you that too?" he returned with an involuntary curl of the lip. "Pshaw, this is idle talk, but sick people will have their fancies. I've one at present. I want you not to wear that rubbish any more," touching her hand lightly. "Oh, Rex, the ring you gave me," the tears starting to her eyes. "I never threw a flower away, the gift of one that cared for me," he replied, with a weak laugh. "I never had a dear gazelle, but it was sure to marry the market gardener. Do you remember Dick Swiveller, Polly, and the many laughs we have had over him in the old garden at home? Oh, those days," checking himself abruptly, for fear the pent-up bitterness might find vent. "Children, you are talking too much," interposed Mildred's warning voice, not slow to interpret the rising excitement of Roy's manner. "1 minute more, Aunt Millie," he returned hastily, then dropping his voice. "The gift must go back to the giver. I don't want you to wear that ugly little ring any longer, Polly." "But I prize it so," she remonstrated. If I give it back to you, you will throw it in the fire or trample on it. On my honor, no, but I can't stand seeing you wear such rubbish. I will keep it safely. I will indeed, Polly. Do please me in this. And Polly, who had never refused him anything, drew off the shabby little ring from her finger and handed it to him with downcast eyes. Why should he ask from her such a sacrifice? Every ribbon and every flower he had given her she had hoarded up as though they were of priceless value, and now he had taken from her her most cherished treasure, and Polly's lip quivered so that she could hardly bid him good night. Good night. Richard, who saw the girl was fretting, tried by every means in his power to cheer her. He threw on another log, placed her little basket-work chair in the most inviting corner, showed her the different periodicals he had brought from Oxford for Roy's amusement, and gave her lively sketches of undergraduate life. Polly showed her interest very languidly. She was mourning the loss of her ring, and thinking how much her long-desired interview with Roy had disappointed her. Would he never be the same to her again? Would this sad misunderstanding always come between them? How was it she was clinging to him with the old fondness till he had mentioned Dr. Heriot's name, and then their hands had fallen asunder simultaneously? Poor Roy, and poor Polly, she thought, with a self-pity as new as it was painful. You are not listening to me, Polly. You are tired, my dear, Richard said at last, in his kind, fraternal way. No, I'm very rude, but I cannot help thinking of Rex, how ill he is, and how terribly wasted he looks. I knew it would be a shock to you. I'm thankful that my father's gout prevents him from travelling. He would fret dreadfully over Roy's altered appearance, but we must be thankful that he is as well as he is. I could not help thinking all that night, the night before you and Aunt Millie came, what I should do if we lost him. Don't, Richard, I cannot bear to think of it. It ought to make us so grateful, he murmured. First Olive, and then Roy, brought back from the very brink of the grave. It is too much goodness. It makes one ashamed of one's discontent, and he sighed involuntarily. But it is so sad to see him so helpless. You said he was as light as a child when you lifted him, Richard, as if he speaks a word or two. He coughs. I'm afraid Dr. Blenkinsop is right in saying he must go to Hastings for the winter. We shall hear what Dr. John says when he comes up next. You expect him soon, Polly? But Richard, as he asked the question, avoided meeting her eyes. He feared lest this long absence had excited suspicions which he might find difficult to answer. But Polly's innocence was proof against any such surmises. I cannot think what keeps him, she returned, disconsolately. Olive says he is not very busy, and that his new assistant relieves him of half his work. And he gives you no reason, touching the log, to elicit another shower of sparks. No, he only says that he cannot come at present, and answers all my reproaches with jests. You know his way. I don't think he half knows how I want him. Richard, I do wish you would do something for me. Write to him tomorrow, and ask him to come. Tell him I want him very badly, that I never wanted him half so much before. Dear Polly, you cannot need him so much as that, trying to turn off her earnestness with a laugh. You do not know, none of you know, how much I want him, with a strange vehemence in her tone. When he is near me, I feel safe, almost happy. Ah, cried the girl, with a sad wistfulness coming into her eyes, when I see him, I do not need to remind myself of his goodness and love. I can feel it then. Oh, Richard, dear, tell him he must come, that I am afraid to be without him any longer. Afraid of what? Did she know? Did Richard know? She seems very restless without you, he wrote that Sunday afternoon. I fancy Roy's manner frets her. He is fitful in his moods, a little irritable even to her, and yet unable to bear her out of his sight. He would be brought down into the studio again today, though Aunt Millie begged him to spare himself. Polly has been trying all the afternoon to amuse him, but he will not be amused. She has just gone off to the piano, in the hope of singing him to sleep. Rex tyrannizes over us all dreadfully. Dr. Heriot sighed over Richard's letter, but he made no attempt to facilitate his preparations for going to London. He was reading things by a clear light now. This failure of his was a sore subject to him, in spite of the prospect that was dawning slowly before him. He could not bear to think of the tangled web he had so unthinkingly woven, It would need careful unraveling, he thought, and so curious is the mingled warp and woof in the mind of a man like John Heriot, that while his heart yearned for Mildred with the strong passion of his nature, he felt for his young betrothed a tenderness for which there was no name, and the thought of freeing himself and her was painful in the extreme. He longed to see her again and judge for himself, but he must be patient for a while, he knew. So though Polly pleaded for his presence almost passionately, he still put her off on some pretext or other, nor did he come till a strong letter of remonstrance from Mildred reached him, reproaching him for his apparent neglect, and begging him to recall the girl, as their present position was not good for her or Roy. Mildred was constrained to take this step, urged by her pity for Polly's evident unhappiness. That some struggle was passing in the girl's mind was now evident. Was she becoming shaken in her loyalty to Dr. Heriot? Mildred grew alarmed. She saw that while Roy's invalid fancies were obeyed with the old Polly-like docility and sweetness, that she shrank at times from him, as though she were afraid to trust herself with him. Sometimes at a look or word she would rise from his side and go to the piano and sing softly to herself some airs that Dr. Heriot loved. "You never sing my old favourites now, Polly," Roy said once, rather fretfully, "but only these old things over and over again." "I like to sing these best," she said hastily, and then, as he still pressed the point, she pushed the music from her and hurried out of the room. But Mildred had another cause for uneasiness which she kept to herself. There was no denying that Roy was very slow in regaining strength. Dr. Blenkinsop shook his head and looked more dissatisfied every day. "I don't know what to make of him," he owned to Mildred one day, as they stood in the porch together. It was a mild December afternoon. A red, wintry sun hung over the little garden. A faint crescent moon rose behind the trees. Underneath the window a few chrysanthemums shed a soft blur of violet and dull crimson. A slight wind stirred the hair from Mildred's temples, showing a streak of gray, but worn and thin as she looked. Dr. Blenkinsop thought he had never seen a face that pleased him better. "What a sister of mercy she would make," he often thought. "If I know anything of human nature, this woman has known a great sorrow. She has been taught patience in a rough school. No matter how that boy tries her, she has always a cheerful answer ready for him." But Dr. Blenkinsop was in rather a bad humor this afternoon, a fact that was often patent enough to his patients, whom he was given to treat on such occasions with some brusquerie, but with all his oddities and contradictions, they dearly loved him. "I can't make him out at all," he repeated irritably, feeling his iron-gray whiskers, a trick of his when anything discomposed him. "There is no fault to find with his constitution. He has had a sharp bout of illness, brought on, as far as I can make out, by his own imprudence, and just as he has turned the corner nicely and seems doing us all credit, he declines to make any further progress. But he is really better, Dr. Blenkinsop. He coughs far less, and his sleep is less broken. He has no appetite, certainly, but—" Mildred stopped. She thought herself that Roy had been losing ground lately. Dr. Blenkinsop fairly growled. He had little sharp white teeth that showed almost savagely when he was in one of his surly moods. "These lymphatic natures are the worst to combat. They succumb so readily to weakness and depression. He certainly seems more languid today, and there are feverish indications. He has got nothing on his mind, eh?" turning round so abruptly that Mildred was put out of countenance. She hesitated. "Humph," was his next observation. "I thought as much. Of course it is none of my concern, but when I see my patient losing ground without any visible cause, one begins to ask questions. That young lady who assists in the nursing, do you think her presence advisable, eh?" with another sharp glance at Mildred. "She is his adopted sister. She is engaged," stammered Mildred, not willing to betray the lad's secret. "They are very fond of each other." "A questionable sort of fondness. Rather too feverish on one side, I should say. Send her back to the north and get that nice fellow Richard in her place. That is my advice." And acting on this very broad hint, Mildred soon afterwards wrote to Dr. Heriot to recall Polly. When Dr. Blenkinsop had left her, she did not at once return to the studio. Through the closed door she could hear Polly striking soft chords on the piano. Roy had seemed drowsy, and she trusted the girl's murmuring voice would lull him to sleep. It was not often that she left them together, but this afternoon her longing for a little fresh air tempted her to undertake some errands that were needed for the invalid, and leaving a message with Mrs. Madison that she would be back to the early tea, she set off in the direction of the old town. It was getting rapidly dusk as the little gate swung behind Mildred. When Roy roused from his fitful slumber, he could hardly see Polly as she sat at the shabby square piano. The girl was touching the notes with listless fingers, her head drooping over the keys, but she suddenly started when she saw the tall, gaunt figure beside her in the gorgeous dressing-gown. "Oh, Rex, this is very wrong," taking hold of one of his hot hands and trying to lead him back to the sofa. "When you know you cannot stand, and that the least movement makes you cough, put your hand on my shoulder, lean on me. Oh, I wish I were as strong and tall as Aunt Millie." "I like you best as you are," he replied, but he did not refuse the support she offered him. "I could not see you over there, only the outline of your dress. You never wear your pretty dresses now, Polly," reproachfully. "I suppose because Harriet is not here." Indeed, you must not stand any longer, Rex. You must lie down at once, or I shall tell Aunt Millie," she returned evasively. He was always making these sort of speeches to her, and tonight she felt as though she could not bear them. But Roy was not to be silenced. Never once had she mentioned Dr. Harriot's name to him, and with an odd tenacity he wanted to make her say it. What did she call him? Had she learnt to say his Christian name? Would she pronounce it with a blush, faltering over it as girls do, or would she speak it glibly as with long usage? "I suppose you keep them all for him," he continued with a suspicion of bitterness in his tone. "That little nun-like grey dress is good enough for Aunt Millie and me. Too much colour would be bad for weak eyes, eh, Polly? I dress for him, of course," trying to defend herself with dignity, but the next moment she waxed humble again. I'm sorry you do not like the dress, Rex," she faltered. "I should like to please you both if I could," and her eyes filled with tears. "I think you might sing sometimes to please me when he is not here," he returned obstinately. "Just one song, Polly, my favourite one, with that sad, sweet refrain." "Oh, not that one," she repeated, beginning to tremble. "Choose something else, Rex. Not that." "No, I will have that or none," he replied irritably. What had become of Roy's sweet temper? "You seem determined not to please me in anything," and he moved away. Polly watched his tottering steps a moment, and then she sprang after him. "Oh, Rex, do not be so cross with me. Do not refuse my help," she said, winding her arm round him and compelling him to lean on her. "There, you have done yourself mischief," as he paused, overcome by a paroxysm of coughing. How can you be so unkind to me, Rex?" He did not answer, perhaps absorbed in his own trouble. He hardly knew how he tried her, but as he sank back feebly on the cushions, he whispered, "You will sing it, Polly, will you not?" Yes, anything, if you will only not be angry with me," returned the poor girl as she hurried away. The air was a mournful one, just suited to the words. "Ask me no more. What answer should I give? I love not hollow cheek or faded eye. Yet, O my friend, I will not have thee die. Ask me no more, lest I should bid thee live. Ask me no more." "Polly, come here, come to me, Polly." For overcome by a sudden revulsion of feeling, Polly had broken down and hidden her face in her hands, and now a stifled sob reached Roy's ear. "Polly, I dare not move, and I only want to ask you to forgive me," in a remorseful voice, and the girl obeyed him reluctantly. "What makes you so cruel to me?" she panted, looking at him with sad eyes that seemed to pierce his selfishness. "It is not my fault if you are so unhappy, if you will not get well." "Ask me no more. Thy faded mine are sealed." The plaintive rhythm still haunted her. Was she, after all, so much to blame? Was she not suffering too? Why should he lay this terrible burden on her? It was selfish of him to die and leave her to her misery. Roy fairly quailed beneath the girl's indignation and passionate sorrow. "Have I been so hard to you, Polly?" he said humbly. "Are men ever hard to the women they love? There, the murder's out. You must leave me, Polly. You must go back to Harriet. I'm too weak to hide the truth any longer. You must not stay and listen to me," pushing her away with weak force. It was his turn to be agitated now. "Leave me," he repeated. "It is not loyal to Harriet to listen to a fool's maundering. which he has not the wit or the strength to hide. I should only frighten you with my vehemence and do no good. Aunt Milly will be here directly. Leave me, I say." But she only clung to him and called him brother. Alas, how could she leave him? By and by he grew calmer. "Forgive me, Polly. I'm not myself. I ought not to have made you sing that song. No, Rex," in a voice scarcely audible. "When you go back to Harriet, you must tell him all. Ask him not to be hard on me. I never meant to injure him. The man you love is sacred in my eyes. It was only for a little while I hated him." "I will not tell him that." "Listen to me, dear. I ask his pardon, and yours too, for having betrayed myself. I've acted like a weak fool tonight. You were wiser than I, Polly." "There is nothing to forgive," she returned softly. "Harriet will not be angry with you. He knows you are ill, and I will try to forget it. But you must get well, Rex. You will promise to get well for my sake. Shall you grieve very much if I do not? Harriet would comfort you if I did not, Polly." She made an involuntary movement towards him, and then checked herself. "Cruel, cruel," she said, in a voice that sounded dead and cold, and her arms fell to her side. He melted at that. "There, I've hurt you again. What a selfish wretch I am. I shall make a poor thing of life, but I will promise not to die if I can help it. You shall not call me cruel again, Polly." Then she smiled and stretched out her hand to him. "I would not requite your goodness so badly as that. You could always do as you liked with me in the old days, Polly. Turn me round your little finger. If you tell me to get well, I suppose I must try. But the best part of me is gone." She could not answer him. Every word went through her tender heart like a stab. What avail were her love and pity? Never should she be able to comfort him again. Never would her sweet sisterly ministration suffice for him. She must not linger by his side. Her eyes were open now. "Goodbye, Roy," she faltered. She hardly knew what she meant by that farewell. Was she going to leave him? Was she only saying goodbye to the past, to girlhood, to all manner of fond, foolish dreams? She rose with dry eyes when she had uttered that little speech, while he lay watching her. "Do you mean to leave me?" he asked, sorrowfully, but not disputing her decision. "Perhaps, yes. What does it matter?" she answered, moving drearily away. What did it matter indeed? Her fate and his were sealed. Between them stretched a gulf long as life, impassable as death, and even her innocent love might not span it. "I shall not go to him, and he will not return to me," she said, paraphrasing the words of the royal mourner to harmonize with her measure of pain. "Never while I live shall I have my brother Roy again." Poor little aching, childish heart, dealing for the first time with life's mysteries, comprehending now the relative distinction between love and gratitude, and standing with reluctant feet on the edge of an unalterable resolve. What sorrow, in after years, ever equaled this blank? When Mildred returned, she found a very desolate scene awaiting her. The fire had burnt low. A waste of dull red embers filled the grate. The moon shone through the one uncurtained window. A mass of drapery stirred at her entrance. A yawning figure stretched itself under the oriental quilt. "Roy, were you asleep? The fire is nearly out. Where is Polly?" "I do not know. She left the room just now," he returned, with a sleepy inflection, but to Mildred's delicate perception it did not ring true. She said nothing, however, raked the embers together, threw on some wood, and lighted the lamps. Had he really slept? There was no need to ask the question. His burning hand, the feverish light of his eyes, the compressed lips, the baffled and tortured lines of the brow, told her another story. She leant over him, pressing them out with soft fingers. "Rex, my poor boy." "Aunt Milly, she has bidden me good-bye," broke out the lad suddenly. "She knows, and she is going back to Harriet. And I am the most miserable wretch alive." End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Harriet's Choice. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Harriet's Choice by Rosa Nouchette Carey. Chapter 31. Which shall it be? She looked again, as one that, half afraid, would fain be certain of a doubtful thing, or one beseeching, do not me upbraid." And then she trembled like the fluttering of timid little birds, and silent stood. Jean Ingelow. Dr. Heriot started for London the day after he had received Mildred's letter. As he intended, his appearance took them all by surprise. Mildred was the first to detect the well-known footsteps on the gravelled path, but she held her peace. Dr. Heriot's keen glance, as he stood on the threshold, had time to scan the features of the little fireside group before a word of greeting had crossed his lips. He noticed Polly's listless attitude as she sat apart in the dark window seat, and the moody restlessness of Roy's face as he lay furtively watching her. Even Mildred's heightened color as she bent industriously over her work was not lost on him. "Polly," he said, crossing the room, and marveling at her unusual abstraction. At the sound of the kind, well-known voice, the girl started violently, but as he stooped over her and kissed her, she turned very white and involuntarily shrank from him, but the next moment she clung to him almost excitedly. "Oh, Harriet, why did you not come before? You knew I wanted you. You must have known how I wanted you." "Yes, dear, I knew all about it," he replied quietly, putting away the little cold hands that detained him, and turning to the others. A few kind inquiries after the invalid were met at first very irritably, but even Roy's jealousy could not be proof against such gentleness, and he forgot his wretchedness for a time while listening to home messages and all the budget of Kirkby Stephen gossip which Dr. Heriot retailed over the cosy meal that Mildred provided for the traveller. For once Dr. Heriot proved himself an inexhaustible talker. There was no limit to his stock of anecdotes. Roy's sulkiness vanished. He grew interested, almost amused. "You remember old Mrs. Parkinson and her ginger cakes, Polly," he said, with a weak ghost of a laugh. But then he checked himself with a frown. How was it one could not hate this fellow who had defrauded him of Polly? He thought, clenching his hand impatiently. Why was he to succumb to a charm of manner that had worked him such woe? Dr. Heriot's fine instinct perceived the lad's transition of mood. "Yes, Polly has a faithful memory for an old friend," he said, answering for the girl, who sat near him with a strip of embroidery from which she had not once raised her eyes. As he looked at her, his face worked with some strong emotion, his eyes softened and then grew sad. "Polly," his faith itself, speaking with peculiar intonation, and laying his hand on the small shining head, "you see I have a new name for you tonight, Heart's Ease." "I think I will go to bed, Aunt Milly," broke out poor Roy, growing suddenly pale and haggard. I'm tired, and it is later tonight, I think." Dr. Heriot made no effort to combat his resolution. He stood aside while Mildred offered her arm to the invalid. He saw Polly hurriedly slip her hand in Roy's, who wrung it hard with a sort of laugh. "It is good-bye, for good and all, I suppose, tonight," he said. "Harriet means to take you away, of course." But Polly did not answer. She only hid her red, quivering hand under her work, as though she feared Dr. Heriot would see it. But the next moment the work was thrown lightly to the ground, and Dr. Heriot's fingers were gently stroking the ill-used hand. "Poor little Polly, does he often treat you to such a rough handshake?" he said, with a half-amused, tender smile. "No, never," she stammered, but then, as though gaining courage from the kind face looking down at her, "Oh, Harriet, I'm so glad he is gone. I want to speak to you." "Is that why you've been so silent?" drawing her nearer to him as she stood beside him on the rug. "Little Heartsease, did you like my new name?" "Don't, Harriet. I do not understand you. I've not been faithful, at least." "Not in your sense of the word, perhaps, dear Polly, but in mine. What if your faithfulness should save us both from a great mistake? I do not understand you, she said again, looking at him with sad, bewildered eyes. You shall talk to me presently, but now I want to speak to you. Harriet, I was wrong to come here. Wrong and self-willed. Aunt Millie was right. I've done no good. Oh, it has all been so miserable, a mistake from beginning to end. And then I thought you would never come. Dear Polly, it could not be helped, neither can I stay now. You will not go and leave me again, she said, faltering and becoming very pale. Harriet, you must take me with you. Promise me that you will take me with you. I cannot, my dear child. Indeed, indeed I cannot. Then I will go alone, she said, throwing back her head proudly, but trembling as she spoke. I will not stay here without you, not for a day, not for a single day. But Roy wants you. You cannot leave him until he is better, he said, watching her. But though she colored perceptibly, she stood her ground. I was wrong to come, she returned piteously. I cannot help it if Rex wants me. I know he does. You are saying this to punish me, and because I have failed in my duty. Hush, my child, I at least have not reproached you. No, you never reproached me, your kindness itself. Harriet, laying down her face on his arm, and now he knew she was weeping. I never knew until lately how badly I've treated you. You ought not to have chosen a child like me. I've tried your patience and given you no return for your goodness, but I have resolved that all this shall be altered. Is it in your power, Polly? Speaking now more gravely. It must, it shall be. Listen to me, dear. You asked me once to make no unnecessary delay, but to be your wife at once. Harriet, I am ready now. No, my child, no. Ah, but I am, speaking with difficulty through her sobs. I never cared for you so much. I never wanted you so much. I'm so full of gratitude. I long to make you so happy, to make somebody happy. You must take me away from here where Roy will not make me miserable any more, and then I shall try to forget him, his unhappiness, I mean, and to think only of you. Poor child, speaking more to himself than to her, and this is to what I have brought her. You must not be angry with Roy, continued the young girl, when her agitation had a little subsided. He could not help my seeing what he felt, and then he told me to go back to you. He has tried his hardest, I know he has. Every night I prayed that you might come and take me away, and every morning I dreaded lest I should be disappointed. Harriet, it was cruel, cruel to leave me so long. And you will come back with me now? Oh, yes, with a little sighing breath. And I am to make you my wife. I am not to wait for your 19th birthday. No, oh, Harriet, how self-willed and selfish I was. Neither one nor the other. Listen to me, dear Polly. Nay, you are trembling so that you can hardly stand. Sit beside me on this couch. It is my turn to talk now. I've a little story to tell you. A story, Harriet? Yes, shall we call it the guardian's mistake? I'm not much of a hand in storytelling, but I hope I shall make my meaning clear. What, afraid, my child? Nay, there is no sad ending to this story of mine. It runs merrily to the tune of wedding bells. I do not want to hear it, she said, shrinking nervously, but he, half laughingly and half seriously, persisted. Once upon a time, shall we say that, Polly? Little heart sees how pale you are growing. Once upon a time, a great many years ago, a man committed a great mistake that darkened his after-life. He married a woman whom he loved, but whose heart he had not won. Not that he knew that. Heaven forbid that anyone, calling himself a man, should do so base a thing as that. But his wishes and his affection blinded him, and the result was misery for many a year to come. But he grew comforted in time, interrupted Polly softly. Yes, time and friendship and other blessings bestowed by the good God healed the bitterness of the wound, but it still bled inwardly. He was a weary-hearted man, with a secret disgust of life, and full of sad loathing for the empty home that sheltered his loneliness all the more, as Polly pressed closer to him, that he was one who had ever craved for wife and children. It was at this time, just as memory was growing faint, that a certain young girl, the daughter of an old college friend of his, was left to his care. Think, Polly, how sacred a charge to this desolate man, a young orphan, alone in the world and dependent on his care. Harriet, I beseech you to stop your breaking my heart. Nay, dearest, there is nothing sad in my story. There are only wheels within wheels. a complication heightening the interest of the plot. Well, was it a wonder that this man, this nameless hero of ours, a species of Don Quixote in his way, should weave a certain sweet fancy into his dreary life, that he should conceive the idea of protecting and loving this young girl in the best way he could, by making her his wife, thinking that he would make himself and her happy, but always thinking most of her? Oh, Harriet, no more, have pity on me. What, stop in the middle of my story, and before my second hero makes his appearance? For shame, heart's ease. But this man, for all his wise plans and benevolent schemes, proved himself miserably blind. He knew that this girl had an adopted brother, whom she loved dearly. Nay, do not hide your face, Polly. No angel's love could have been purer than this girl's for this friend of hers. But alas, what no one had foreseen had already happened. Unknown to her guardian and to herself, this young man had always loved and desired to win her for his wife. She never knew it, in a stifled voice. No, she never knew it, any more than she knew her own heart. Why do you start, heart's ease? Ah, she was so sure of that, so certain of her love for her affianced husband, that when she knew her friend was ill, she pleaded to be allowed to nurse him. Yes, though she had found out then the reason of his unhappiness. She hoped to do good, clasping her hands before her face. True, she hoped to do good. She fancied, not knowing the world and her own heart, that she could win him back to his old place, and so keep them both, her guardian and her friend. And her guardian, heartsick at the mistake he had made, and with a new and secret sorrow preying upon him, deliberately suffered her to be exposed to the ordeal that her own generous imprudence had planned. Harriet, one moment you have a secret sorrow. Not an incurable one, my sweet. You shall know it by and by. If I do not mistake, it will yield us a harvest of joy. But I am drawing near the end of the story. Yes, you have quite finished. There is nothing more to say, nothing, Harriet. You shall tell me the rest then, he returned gravely. Was she true to her guardian, this girl, true in every fibre and feeling, or did her faithful heart really cleave to the companion of her youth, calling her love by the right name and acknowledging it without fear? Polly, this is no time for a half-truth. Which shall it be? Is your heart really mine, or does it belong to Roy? She would have hidden her face in her hands, but he would not suffer it. Child, you must answer me. There must be no shadow between us, he said, holding her before him. There was a touch of sternness in his voice, but as she raised her eyes appealingly to his, she read there nothing but pity and full of understanding. For one moment she stood irresolute, with palpitating heart and white quivering lips, and then she threw herself into his arms. Oh, Harriet, what shall I do? What shall I do? I love you both, but I love Roy best. When Mildred re-entered the room, an hour later, somewhat weary of her banishment, she found the two still talking together. Polly was sitting in her little low chair, her cheek resting on her hand. Dr. Harriot seemed speaking earnestly, but as the door opened, he broke off hastily, and the girl started to her feet. I must go now, she whispered. Don't tell Aunt Millie tonight. Oh, Harriet, I am so happy. This seems like some wonderful dream. I don't half believe it. We must guard each other's confidence. Remember, I've trusted you, Polly, was his answer in a low tone. Good night, my dearest child. Sleep well and say a prayer for me. I do pray for you always, she affirmed, looking at him with her soul in her eyes, but as he merely pressed her hand kindly, she suddenly raised herself on tiptoe and kissed his cheek. Dear, dear Harriet, I shall pray for you all my life long. Are you going, Polly? Asked Mildred in surprise. Yes, I'm tired. I cannot talk any more tonight, returned the girl hastily. Her face was pale, as though she had been weeping, but her eyes smiled radiantly under the wet lashes. Mildred turned to the fire, somewhat dissatisfied. I hope things are right between you and Polly, she said anxiously when she and Dr. Harriot were left alone. They've never been more so, he replied with a mischievous smile. For the first time we thoroughly understand ourselves and each other. She is a dear, good child, and deserves to be happy. But as Mildred, somewhat bewildered at the ambiguous tone, would have questioned him still further, he gently but firmly changed the subject. It was a strange evening to Mildred. Outside the rain lashed the panes. Dr. Harriot had drawn his armchair nearer to the glowing fire. He looked spent and weary. Some conflicting feelings seemed to fetter him with sadness. Mildred, sitting at her little work-table, scarcely dared to break the silence. Her own voice sounded strange to her. Once when she looked up, she saw his eyes were fixed upon her, but he withdrew them again and relapsed into his old thoughtfulness. By and by he began to talk, and then she laid down her work to listen. Some strange chord of the past seemed stirred in the man's heart tonight. All at once he mentioned his mother. Her name was Mildred, he said, looking into the embers as he spoke, and a little sister whom they had lost in her childhood had been called Millie too. For their sakes the name had always been dear to him. She was a good woman, he said, but her one fault in his eyes had been that she had never loved Margaret. A certain bitter scene between them had banished his widowed mother from his house. Margaret had not understood her, and they were better apart, but it had been a matter of grief to him. And then he began to talk of his wife, at first hesitatingly, and then, as Mildred's silent sympathy seemed to open the long-closed valves, the repressed sorrow of years began to find vent. Well might Mildred marvel at the secret strength that had sustained the generous heart in its long struggle, at the charity that suffered so long. What could there have been about this woman that even degradation and shame could not weaken his faithful love, that even in his misery he should still pity and cleave to her? As though answering her thought, Dr. Heriot suddenly placed a miniature in her hand. That was taken when I first saw her, he said softly, but it does not do her justice, and then one cannot reproduce that magnificent voice. I've never heard a voice like it. Mildred bent over it for a moment without speaking. It was the face of a girl, taken in the first flush of her youth, but there was nothing youthful in the face, which was full of a grave, matured beauty. The dark, melancholy eyes seemed to rivet Mildred's. A wild sorrow lurked in their inscrutable depths. The brow spoke intellect and power. The mouth had a passionate, irresolute curve. As she looked at it, she felt that it was a face that might well haunt a man to his sorrow. It is beautiful, beautiful, but it oppresses me, she said, laying it down with a sigh. I cannot fancy it ever looking happy. No, he returned, with a stifled voice. Her one trouble embittered her life. I never remember seeing her look really happy till I placed our boy in her arms. He taught her to smile first, and then he died, and our happiness died with him. You must try to forget all this now, she said, alluding to his approaching marriage. It is not well to dwell upon so mournful a past. You are right. I think I shall bury it from this night, he returned, with a singular smile. I feel as though you have done me good, Mildred, Miss Lambert, but now I am selfishly keeping you up. After all, you're nursing too. Good night. He held her hand for a moment in both his. His eyes questioned the pale, worn face, anxiously, tenderly. When are you going to get stronger? You do me no credit, he said sadly. And his look and tone haunted her. In spite of her efforts, he had called her Mildred, too. How strange that he should have told me all this about his wife. I'm glad he treats me as a friend, she thought. A little while ago I could not have spoken to him as I have tonight, but his manner puts me at my ease. How can I help loving one of the noblest of God's creatures? Can you trust Roy to me this morning? Miss Lambert asked Dr. Heriot as they were sitting together after breakfast. Polly, who was arranging a jar of chrysanthemums, dropped a handful of flowers on the floor and stooped to pick them up. I think Roy will like his old nurse best, she returned doubtfully, but Dr. Heriot looked obstinate. A new regime, any new prescription might be beneficial, he replied with a suspicion of a smile. Roy and I must have some conversation together, and there's no time like the present. And with a grave, mischievous bow, he quietly quitted the room. Aunt Millie, I must go and match those wools and get the books for Roy, began Polly hurriedly, as they were left alone. The rain does not matter a bit, and the air is quite soft and warm. Mildred shook her head. You'd better wait an hour or two till it clears up, she said, looking dubiously at the wet garden paths and soaking rain. I'm going to my own room to write letters. I've one from Olive that I must answer. If you will wait until the afternoon, Dr. Heriot will go with you. But Polly was not to be dissuaded. She had nothing to do. She was restless and wanted a walk, and Roy must have his third volume when he came down. It was not often that Polly chose to be wilful, and this time she had her way. Now and then Mildred paused in the midst of her correspondence to wonder what had detained the girl so long. Once or twice she rose and went to the window to see if she could catch a glimpse of the dark blue cloak and black hat, but hours passed and she did not return. By and by Dr. Heriot's quick eyes saw a swift shadow cross the studio window, and as Polly stole noiselessly into the dark passage, she found herself captured. "Naughty child, where have you been?" he said, removing her wet cloak, and judging for himself that she had sustained no further damage. Polly's cheeks, rosy with exercise, paled a little, and she pleaded piteously to be set free. "Just for a moment, Harriet. Please let me go for a moment. I will come presently." "You are not to be trusted," he replied, not leaving hold of her. "Do you think this excitement is good for Roy? That in his state he can bear it? He has been dressed and waiting for you for hours. You must think of him, Polly, not of yourself." And Polly resisted no longer. She followed Dr. Heriot with downcast eyes into the studio. Roy was not on his couch. He was standing on the rug in his velvet coat. One thin hand grasped the mantelpiece nervously. The other was stretched out to Polly. "You must not let him excite himself," was Dr. Heriot's warning, as he left them together. Poor Polly! She stood irresolute, not daring to advance or look up, and wishing that the ground would swallow her. "Polly, dear Polly, will you not come to me?" And Roy walked feebly to meet her. Before she could move or answer, his arms were round her. "My Polly, my own, now," he cried, rapturously pressing her to him with weak force. "Harriet has given you to me." Polly looked up at her young lover shyly. Roy's face was flushed. His eyes were shining with happiness. A half-proud, half-humble expression lingered round his mouth. The arm that supported her trembled with weakness. "Oh, Rex, how wrong of me to let you stand," she said, waking up from her bewilderment. "You must lie down, and I will take my old place beside you." "Yes, he has given you the right to nurse me now," whispered Roy, as she arranged the cushions under his head. "I'm more than your adopted brother now," and Polly's happy blush was her only answer. "You will never refuse to sing to me again," he said presently, when their agitation had a little subsided. "No, and you will let me have my old ring," she returned softly. "Oh, Rex, I cried half the night when you would not let me wear it. I never cared so much for my beautiful diamonds." A misty smile crossed Roy's face. "No, Polly, I never mean to part with it again. Look here," and he showed her the garnets suspended to his watch-chain. "We will exchange rings in the old German fashion, dear. I will keep the garnets, and I will buy you the pearl hoop you admired so much. You must remember you have chosen only a poor artist." "Oh, Rex, how I shall glory in your pictures," cried the girl breathlessly. "I have always loved them for your sake, but now it will be so different. They will be dearer than ever to me." "I never could have worked without you, Polly," returned the young man humbly. "I tried, but it was a miserable failure. It was your childish praise that first made me seriously think of being an artist, and when you failed me, all the spirit seemed to die out of me, just as the sunshine fades out of a landscape, leaving nothing but a grey mist. Oh, Polly, even you scarcely know how wretched you made me." "Do not let us talk of it," she whispered, pressing closer to him. "Let us only try to deserve our happiness." "That is what he said," replied Roy in a low voice. "He told me that we were very young to have such a responsibility laid upon us, and that we must help each other. Oh, what a good man he is," he continued with some emotion, "and to think that at one time I almost hated him." "You could not help it," she answered shyly. To her there was no flaw in her young lover. His impatience and jealousy, his hot and cold fits that had so sorely tried her, his singular outbursts of temper, had only been natural under the circumstances. She would have forgiven him harder usage than that, but Roy judged himself more truly. "No, dear, you must not excuse me," was the truthful answer. "I bore my trouble badly, and made every one round me wretched, and now all these coals of fire are heaped upon me. If he had been my brother, he could not have borne with me more gently." "Oh," cried the lad earnestly, "it is something to see into the depths of a good man's heart. I think I saw more than he meant me to do, but time will prove. One thing is certain, that he never loved you as I do, Polly." "No, it was all a strange mistake," she returned, blushing and smiling. "But hush, here comes Aunt Milly." "Am I interrupting you?" asked Mildred, a little surprised at Polly's anxious start. She had moved a little away from Roy, but now he stretched out his hand to detain her. "No, don't go, Aunt Millie," and a gleam of mischief shot from his blue eyes. "Polly has only been telling me a new version of the old song. It is well to be off with the old love before you are on with the new. After all, Polly has found out that she likes me best." "Children, what do you mean?" returned Mildred, somewhat sternly. Polly and even Roy were awed by the change in her manner. A sort of spasm crossed her face, and then the features became almost rigid. "Aunt Millie, don't be angry with us," faltered Polly, and her breast heaved a little. Did this dearest and gentlest creature, who had stood her in the stead of mother, think she was wrong? "Listen to me, dear. I would have married Harriot, but he would not let me. He showed me what was the truth, that my heart was more Roy's than his, and then he brought us together. It is all his doing, not Roy's." "Yes, it was all my doing," repeated Dr. Harriot, who had followed Mildred in unperceived. "Did I not tell you last night that Polly and I never understood each other so well?" And he put his arm round the girl with almost fatherly fondness as he led her to Mildred. "You must blame me and not this poor child for all that has happened." But the color did not return to Mildred's face. She seemed utterly bewildered. Dr. Harriot wore his inscrutable expression. He looked grave, but not otherwise unhappy. "I suppose it is all for the best," she said somewhat unsteadily. "I had hoped that Polly would have been a comfort to you, but it seems you are never to have that." "It will come to me in time," he returned with a strange smile. "At least I hope so." "Come here, Aunt Millie," interrupted Roy. And as Mildred stooped over her boy, he looked up in her face with the old Rex-like smile. "Dr. Harriot says I should never have lived if it had not been for you, Aunt Millie. You have given me back my life, and he has given me Polly." And cried the lad, and now his lips quivered, "God bless you both." End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Harriot's Choice. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Harriot's Choice by Rosa Nouchette Carey. Chapter 32, A Talk in FAIRLIGHT, GLEN. O finer far, what work so high is mine, interpreter betwixt the world and man, nature's ungathered pearls to set in shrine, the mystery she wraps her in to scan, her unsyllabic voices to combine, and serve her with such love as poets can, with mortal words, her chant of praise to bind, then die and leave the poem to mankind. Jean Ingelow. Dr. Harriot did not stay long in London. As soon as his mission was accomplished, he set his face resolutely homewards. Christmas was fast approaching, and it was necessary to make arrangements for Roy's removal to Hastings, and after much discussion and a plentiful interchange of letters between the cottage and the vicarage, it was finally settled that Mildred and Richard should remain with the invalid until Olive and Mr. Lambert should take their place. Mr. Lambert was craving for a sight of his boy, but he could not feel justified in devolving his duties on his curate until after the Epiphany, nor would Olive consent to leave him, so Mildred bravely stifled her homesick longings and kept watch over the young lovers, smiling to herself over Roy's boyishness and Polly's fruitless efforts after staidness. From the low bow windows jutting onto the beach, in the quiet corner where Richard had found them lodgings, she would often sit following the young pair with softly amused eyes as they stood hand in hand, with the waves lapping to their feet. At the first streak of sunset they would come slowly up the shore, Roy still tall and gaunt, but with a faint tinge of returning health in his face, Polly fresh and blooming as a rose, and trying hard to stay her dancing feet to fit his feeble paces. "What have you done with Richard, children?" Mildred would ask as usual. "Dick, he decamped long ago," with the trite and novel observation that 2 are company and 3 none. "We saw him last in the midst of an admiring crowd of fishermen. Dick always knows when he is not wanted, eh, Polly?" "I'm afraid we treat him very badly," returned Polly, blushing. Roy threw himself down on the couch with a burst of laughter. His mirth had hardly died away when his brother entered. You have got back, Roy? That's right. I was just going in search of you. There is a treacherous wind this evening. You were standing still ever so long after I left you. That comes of you leaving us, you see, replied Roy slyly. It took us just half an hour to discover the reason of your abrupt departure. Richard's eyes twinkled with dry humor. One must confess to being bored at times. Capel was far more entertaining company than you and Polly. When I am in despair for a little sensible conversation, I must come to Aunt Millie. Aunt Millie was the universal sympathizer as usual. Richard's patience would have been sorely put to proof, but for those grave-toned talks in the wintry twilights, with which the grey sea and sky seemed so strangely to harmonize. In spite of his unselfishness, the sight of his brother's happiness could not fail to elicit at times a disturbing sense of contrast. Who could tell what years rolled between them and the fruition of his hope? Impatience and confidence must be your strength, Richard, Mildred once said, as they stood looking over the dim waste of waters, grey everywhere, save where the white lips touched the shore. Behind them was the dark Castle Hill. Windy flickers of light came from the esplanade. Far out to sea a little star trembled and wavered like the timid pioneer of unknown light. A haze of uncertainty bordered earth and sky. The soft wash of the insidious waves was tuneful and soothing as a lullaby. The neutral tints, the colourless conditions, neither light nor dark, even the faint, wrapping mist that came like a cloud from the sea, harmonized with Mildred's feelings as she quoted the text softly. An irrepressible shiver ran through the young man's frame. Waiting, did he not know what was before him? Years of uncertainty, of alternate hopes and fears. Yes, I know, he replied with an accent of impatience in his voice. You are right, of course. One can only wait. As for patience, it is hardly an attribute of youth. One learns it by degrees, but all the same, uncertainty in these low grey skies oppress one. Sea fog does not enhance cheerfulness, Aunt Millie. Let us go in. Richard's moods of discontent were brief and rare. He was battling bravely with his disappointment. He had always been grave and staid beyond his years, but now faintly drawn lines were plainly legible in the smooth forehead, and a steady, concentrated light in the brown eyes bore witness to abiding and careful thought. At times his brother's unreasoning boyishness seemed almost to provoke him. Want of earnestness was always a heinous sin in his judgment. Roy more than once winced under some unpalatable home truth, which Richard uttered in all good faith and with the best intentions in the world. Dick is the finest fellow breathing, but if he would only leave off sermonizing until he is ordained, broke out Roy with a groan, when he and Mildred were alone. But Mildred was too well aware of their affection for each other to be made uneasy by any petulance on Roy's part. He would rail at his brother's advice and then most likely digest and follow it, but she gave Richard a little hint once. Leave them alone. Their happiness is still so new to them, pleaded the soft-hearted woman. You can't expect Rex to look beyond the present yet. Now Polly is with him. When he is stronger, he will settle down to work. And though Richard shook his head a little incredulously, he wisely held his peace. But he would have bristled over with horror and amazement if he had known half of the extravagant daydreams and plans which Roy was forever pouring into Aunt Millie's ear. Roy, who was as impetuous in his love-making as in other things, could not be made to understand that there was any necessity for waiting. That Polly should be due north while he was due south was clearly an absurdity to his mind, and he would argue the point until Mildred was fairly bewildered. Rex, my dear boy, do be reasonable, she pleaded once. What would Richard say if he heard you? You must give up this daft scheme of yours. It is contrary to all common sense. Why, you have never earned £50 by your painting yet. Excuse me, Aunt Millie, but it is so difficult to make women see anything in a business point of view, replied the invalid, somewhat loftily. Polly understands me, of course, but she is an exception to the general rule. I defy anyone, even you, Aunt Millie, to beat Polly in common sense. He means, of course, if his picture be sold, returned Polly sturdily, who feared nothing in the world but separation from Roy. She was ready to eat bread and cheese cheerfully all her life, she thought. Both young people were in the hazy atmosphere of all youthful lovers. When a crust appears a picturesque and highly desirable food, and rent and taxes and all such contemptible items are delusions of the evil one, fostered in the brain of careful parents. Of course, Rex only means if his picture sells at a good price. He will then be sure of work from the dealers. There, I told you so, repeated Roy triumphantly, as though Polly did not know the ups and downs of an artist's life better than you or even me, Aunt Millie. It is not as though we expected champagne and silk dresses and all sorts of unnecessary luxuries. Or velvet coats, quietly added Mildred, and Roy looked a little crestfallen. Aunt Millie, how can you be so unkind, so disagreeable? Cried Polly, with a little burst of indignation. I shall wear print dresses or cheap stuff. There was such a pretty one at 7pence a penny the yard at Oliver's, but of course Rex must have his velvet coat. It looks so well on an artist and suits him so. I would not have Roy look shabby and out of elbows like Dad Fabian for the world. You would look very pretty in a print dress, Polly, I don't doubt, returned Roy a little sadly, but Aunt Millie is right, and it would not match my velvet coat. We must be consistent, as Richard says. Cashmere is not so very dear, and it wears splendidly, returned Polly, in the tone of one elated by a new discovery, and with a fresh ribbon now and then I shall look as well as I do now. You don't suppose I mean to be a slattern if we are ever so poor, but you shall have your velvet coat if I have to pawn the watch Dr. Heriot gave me, and Roy's answer was not meant for Mildred to hear. Mildred felt as though she were turning the page of some storybook as she listened to their talk. How charmingly unreal it all sounded, how splendidly coloured with youth and happiness. After all, they were not ambitious. The rooms at the little cottage at Frognall bounded all their desires. The studio with the cross light and faded drapery, the worn couch and little square piano, was to be their living room. Polly was to work and sing while Roy painted. Dull? How could they be dull when they had each other? Polly would go to market and prepare dainty little dishes out of nothing. She would train flowers round the porch and under the windows and keep chickens in the empty coop by the arbour. With plenty of eggs and fresh vegetables, their expenses would be trifling. Dugald had taught Rex to make potato soup and herring salad. Where he and Dugald had spent he did not know how little a week, and of course his father would help him. Polly was penniless and an orphan, and it was his duty to work for her as well as for himself. Mildred wondered what Dr. Heriot would think of the young people's proposition. As Polly was under age, he had a voice in the matter, but she held her peace on this subject. After all, it was only a daydream, a very pleasant picture. She was conscious of a vague feeling of regret that things could not be as they planned. Roy was boyish and impulsive, but Polly might be trusted, she thought. Every now and then there was a little spirit of shrewdness and humour in the girl's words that bubbled to the surface. Roy will always be wanting to buy new books and new music, but I shall punish him by liking the old ones best, she said with a laugh. And no more boxes of cigarettes or bottles of lavender water. And oh, Rex, you know your extravagance in gloves. I shall only wear them on Sundays, replied Roy virtuously, and I shall smoke pipes. An honest meerschaum, after all, is more enjoyable, and in the evenings we will take long walks towards Hendon or Barnet. Polly is a famous walker, and on fine Sundays we will go to Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's or some of the grand old city churches. One can hear fine music at the Foundling and at St. Andrew's. Wells Street. Polly does not know half the delights of living in London. She will know it in good time, returned Mildred softly. She would not take upon herself to damp their expectations. In a little while they would learn to be reasonable. In the meanwhile she indulged in the petting that was with her as a second nature. But it was a relief when her brother and Olive arrived. She had no idea how much she had missed them until she caught sight of her brother's bowed figure and grey head, and Olive's grave, sallow face beside it. It was an exciting evening. Mr. Lambert was overjoyed at seeing his son again, though much shocked at the still visible evidences of past suffering. Polly was warmly welcomed with a fatherly blessing, and he was so much occupied with the young pair that Mildred was at liberty to devote herself to Olive. She followed her into her room, ostensibly to assist in unpacking, but they soon fell into one of their old talks. "Dear Olive," she said, kissing her, "you don't know how good it is to see you again. I never believed I could miss you so much." "You've not missed me half so much as I have you," returned Olive, blushing with surprised pleasure. "I always feel so lost without you, Aunt Millie, when I wanted you very badly, more than usual, I mean. I used to go into your room and think over all the comforting talks we have had together, and then try and fancy what you would tell me to do in such and such cases." "Dear child, that was drawing from a very shallow well. I remember I told you to fold up all your perplexities in your letters, and I would try and unravel them for you, but I see you were afraid of troubling me." "That was one reason, certainly, but I had another as well. I could not forget what you told me once about the bracing effects of self-decision in most circumstances, and how you once laughingly compared me to Mr. Ready to Halt, and advised me to throw away my crutches. In other words, solving your own difficulties. Certainly I meant what I said. Grown-up persons are so fond of thinking for young people, instead of training them to think for themselves, and then they are surprised that the brain struggles so slowly from the swaddling bands that they themselves have wrapped round them. It was easier than I thought, returned Olive slowly. At first I tormented myself in my old way, and was tempted to renew my arguments about conflicting duties, till I remembered there must be a right and wrong in everything, or at least, by comparison, a better way. Why, you have grown quite a philosopher, Olive. I shall be proud of my pupil, said Mildred, and Mildred looked affectionately at her niece. What a noble-looking woman Olive would be, she thought. True, the face was colourless, and the features far too strongly marked for beauty, but the mild dark eyes and shadowy hair redeemed it from plainness, and the speaking yet subdued intelligence that lingered behind the hesitating speech produced a pleasing impression. Yet Mildred, who knew the face so well, fancied a shadow of past or present sadness tinged the even gravity that was its prevailing expression. Olive's thoughts unfolded slowly like flowers. They always needed the sunshine of sympathy, a keen breath, the light mockery of incredulity killed them on the spot. Now, of her own accord, she began to speak of the young lovers. How happy dear Roy looks. Polly is just suited for him. Do you know, Aunt Milly, I had a sort of presentiment of this. It always seemed to me that she and Dr. Harriet were making believe to like each other. I think Dr. Harriet was tolerably in earnest, Olive. Of course he meant to be, but I always thought there was too much benevolence for the right thing. And as for Polly, oh, it was easy to see that she only tried to be in love. It quite tired her out, the trying, I mean, and made her cross and pettish with us sometimes. I never gave you credit for so much observation. I dare say not, returned Olive simply. Only one wakes up sometimes to find things are turning out all wrong. Do you know, they puzzled me tonight, Rex and Polly, I mean. I expected to find them so different, and they are just the same. How do you mean? I should think it would be difficult to find two happier creatures anywhere. They behave as most young people do under the circumstances, are never willingly out of each other's sight, and talk plenty of nonsense. That is just what I cannot make out. It seems such a solemn and beautiful thing to me that I cannot understand treating it in any other way. Why, they were making believe to quarrel just now, and Polly was actually pouting. Mildred with difficulty refrained from a smile. They do that just for the pleasure of making it up again. If you could see them this moment, you would find them like a pair of cooing doves. It will be poor Rex and dear Rex all the evening. There is no doubt of his affection for her. Olive, it nearly cost his life. That is only an additional reason for treating it seriously. If anyone cared for me in that way, went on Olive, blushing slightly over her words. Not that I could believe such a thing possible, interrupting herself. Why not, you very wise woman? Asked her aunt, amused by this voluntary confession. Never before had Olive touched on this threadbare and oft-maligned subject of love. Aunt Milly, as though you could speak of such a thing as probable, returned Olive with a slight rebuke in her voice. Putting aside plainness and want of attraction and that sort of thing, do you think any man would find me a helpmeet? He must be the right sort of man, of course, a direct opposite to you in everything, she was about to add, but checked herself. But if the right sort is not to be found, Aunt Milly, with a touch of quaintness that at times tinged her gravity with humour, didn't you know, much afraid, was an old maid? We must get rid of all these old names, Olive. They will not fit now. All the same, of course, I know these things are not possible with me. Imagine being a wet blanket to a man all his life. But what I was going to say was that if anyone cared for me as Rex does for Polly, I should think it the next solemn thing to death, quite as beautiful and not so terrible. Fancy warming with the visionary subject. Just fancy Aunt Milly being burdened with the whole happiness and well-being of another, never to think alone again. Dear Olive, you cannot expect all lovers to indulge in these metaphysics. Commonplace minds remain commonplace. The divinities are silent within them. I think this is why I dislike the subject introduced into general conversation, replied Olive, pondering heavily over her words. People are forever dragging it in. So-and-so is to be married next week, and then a long description of the bride's trousseau and the bridesmaids' dresses. The idea is as paganish as the undertaker's plume of feathers and mutes at a funeral. I agree with you there. People almost always treat the subject coarsely or in a matter-of-fact way. A wedding show is a very pretty thing to outsiders, but like you, Olive, I have often marvelled at the absence of all solemnity. I suppose it jars upon me more than on others because I dislike talking on what interests me most. I think sacred things should be treated sacredly, but how I am wandering on, and there was so much I wanted to tell you. Never mind, I will hear it all tomorrow. I must not let you fatigue yourself after such a journey. Now I will finish the unpacking while you sit and rest yourself. Olive was too docile and too really weary to resist. She sat silently watching Mildred's brisk movements till the puzzled look in the dark eyes passed into drowsiness. The eternal voice, she murmured as she laid her head on the pillow, and Mildred bade her good night. It seems to lull one into rest, though a tired child would sleep without rocking, listening to it, and so the slow, majestic washing of the waves bore her into dreamland. Mildred did not find an opportunity of resuming the conversation until the following afternoon, when Richard had planned a walk to FAIRLIGHT Glen, in which Polly reluctantly joined. But Mildred, who knew Roy and his father had much to say to each other, had insisted on not leaving her behind. She was punished by having a very silent companion all the way, as Richard had carried off Olive, but by and by Polly's conscience pricked her for ill-humour and selfishness, and when they reached the glen her hand stole into Mildred's muff with a penitent squeeze, and her spirits rising with the exhilaration of the long walk, she darted off in pursuit of Olive and brought her back, while she offered herself in her place to Richard. You have monopolized her all the way, and I know she is dying for a talk with Aunt Milly. You must put up with me instead, said the little lady defiantly. Mildred and Olive meanwhile seated themselves on one of the benches overlooking the glen. The spot was sheltered and the air mild and soft for January. There were patches of cloudy blue to be seen through the leafless trees, which looked like a procession of grey, hoary skeletons in the hazy light. Woods have a beauty of their own in winter, observed Mildred, as she noticed Olive's satisfied glance round her. Visible beauty always rested her, Olive often said. Its attraction is the attraction of death, returned her companion thoughtfully. Look at these old giants waiting for their resurrection to be clothed upon. That is just the expression, Aunt Milly. With their dead hopes at their feet. You are teaching me to be poetical, Olive. Don't you love the feeling of those crisp yellow leaves crunching softly under one's feet? I think a leaf race in a high wind is one of the most delicious things in nature. Ask Carty what he thinks of that. Carty would say we are talking high-flown nonsense. I can never make him share my admiration for that soft grey light one sees in winter. I remember we were walking over Hill's Bottom one lovely February afternoon. The shades of the landscape were utterly indescribable, half light and yet so softly blended. The grey tone of the buildings was absolutely warm, that intense greyness, and all I could get him to say was that Kirkby Stephen was a very ugly town. Roy is more sympathetic about colours. Carty likes strong contrasts, decided sunsets, better than the glimmering of moonlight nights. He can be enthusiastic enough over some things. I've heard him talk beautifully to Ethel. By the by, you have told me nothing of her. Is she still away? Yes, but they are expecting her back this week or next. It seems such a pity. Kirk Leatham is so often empty. Mrs. Delaware says it is quite a loss to the place. It is certainly very unsatisfactory. But now about your work, Olive. How does it progress? Olive hesitated. I will talk to you about that presently. There is something else that may interest you to hear. Do you know Mr. Marsden is thinking of leaving us? Mildred uttered an expression of surprise and disappointment. Oh, I hope it is not true, she reiterated in a regretful tone. You say that because you do not know, returned Olive with her wonted soft seriousness. He has told me everything. Only think, Aunt Milly, he asked my advice, and really seemed to think I could help him to a decision. Fancy my helping anyone to decide a difficult question, with a smile that seemed to cover deeper feelings. Why not? It only means that he has recognized your earnestness and thorough honesty of purpose. There is nothing like honesty to inspire confidence, Olive. I'm sure you would help him to a very wise decision. I think he had already decided for himself before he came to me, returned the girl meditatively. One can always tell when a man has made up his mind to do a thing. You see, he has always felt an inclination for missionary work, and this really seems a direct call. You forget you have not enlightened me on the subject, hinted Mildred gently. How stupid of me, but I will begin from the beginning. Mr. Marsden told me one morning that he had had letters from his uncle, Archdeacon Champneys, one of the most energetic workers in the Bloemfontein mission. You have read all about it, Aunt Milly, in the quarterly papers. Don't you recollect how interested we all were about it? Yes, I remember. Richard seemed quite enthusiastic about it. Well, the Archdeacon wrote that they were in pressing need of clergy. Look, I have the letter with me. Mr. Marsden said I must show it to you. He has marked the passage that has so impressed him. I'm at my wits' end to know how to induce clergy to come out. Do you know of any priest who would come up to our help? If you do, for God's sake, use your influence to induce him to come. We want help for the Diamond Fields, Theological College, Brotherhood at Middleport, itinerating work, settled parochial work at Philippolis and elsewhere. We want men with strong hearts and active, healthy frames, men with a true missionary spirit, with fixedness of will and undaunted purpose, ready to battle against obstacles and to endure peacefully the many petty, prosaic, commonplace, and harassing trials that beset a new work. If you know such an one, bid him Godspeed and help him to find his way to us. I promise you we shall see his face as the face of an angel. A pressing appeal, sighed Mildred. She experienced a vague regret she hardly understood. Mr. Marsden felt it to be such. Oh, I wish you had heard him talk. He said, as a boy, he had always felt a drawing to this sort of work. that with his health and strength and superabundant energies, he was fitter for the rough life of the colonies than for the secondary and supplementary life of an ordinary English curate. Give me plenty of space and I could do the work of 3 men. And as he said it, he stretched out his arms. You know his way, Aunt Millie, that makes one feel how big and powerful he is. He may be right, but how we shall miss him, returned Mildred, who had a thorough respect and liking for big, clumsy Hugh. Not more than he will miss us. He says he will have it. We have done him so much good, but there is one thing he feels, that Richard will soon be able to take his place. In any case, he will not go until the autumn, not then if his mother be still alive. Is he still so hopeless about her condition? How can he be otherwise, Aunt Millie, when the doctor tells him it is only a question of time? Did you hear that he has resigned all share in the little legacy that has lately come to them? He says it will make them so comfortable that they will not need to keep their little school any longer. Is it not good of him? Went on Olive, warming into enthusiasm. I think he has done the right thing, just what I should have expected him to do. And so you have strengthened him in his decision, Olive? How could I help it? She returned simply. Can there be any life so noble, so self-denying? I told him once that I envied him, and he looked so pleased, and then the tears came into his eyes, and he seemed as though he wanted to say something, but checked himself. Do you know, drooping her head and speaking in a deprecating tone, that hearing him talk like this made me feel dissatisfied with myself and my work? Poor little nightingale, you would rather be a working bee, observed Mildred, smiling. This was the meaning, then, of the shattered brightness she had noticed last night. No, but somehow I could not help feeling his work was more real. The very self-sacrifice it involves sets it apart in a higher place, and then the direct blessing. Aunt Millie, with an effort, what good does my poetry do to anyone but myself? St. Paul speaks of the diversities of gifts, returned Mildred soothingly. She saw that daily contact with perfect health and intense vitality and usefulness had deadened the timid and imaginative forces that worked beneath the surface in the girl's mind. A warped sense of duty or fear from the legions of her old enemies had beset her pleasure with sick loathing. For some reason or other, Olive's creative work had lain idle. Do you recollect the talent laid up in the napkin, Olive? But if it should not be a talent, rather a temptation, whispered the girl under her breath. No, I cannot believe it is that, after all, Aunt Millie, only I have got weary about it. Have I not chosen the work I liked best, the easiest, the most attractive? Do you think a repulsive service would please our beneficent Creator best? Olive was silent. Were the old shadows creeping round her again? Your work just now seems very small by the side of Mr. Marsden's. His vocation and consecration to a new work in some way, and by comparison overshadows yours. Perhaps unconsciously his words have left an unfavorable impression. You know how sensitive you are, Olive. He never imagined that they could influence me. No, he is the kindest-hearted being in the world, and would not willingly damp anyone, but all the same, he might unconsciously vaunt his work before your eyes. But before we decide on the reality or unreality of your talent, I want to recall something to your mind that this same good Bishop of Bloemfontein said in his paper on women's work. I remember how greatly I was struck with it. His exact words, as far as I can remember them, were that work, missionary work, demands fair health, unshattered nerves, and that general equableness of spirits, which so largely depends upon the physical state. A morbid mind or conscience, mark that, Olive, is unfit for the work. But Aunt Millie, blushing slightly, I never meant that I thought myself fit for mission work. You do not think that I would ever leave Papa. No, but a certain largeness of you may help us to exorcise the uneasy demon that is harassing you. You may not have Bloemfontein in your thoughts, but you may be trying to work yourself into the belief that God may be better pleased if you immolate your favorite and peculiar talent and devote yourself to some repugnant ministry of good works where you would probably do more harm than good. I confess some such thoughts as these have been troubling me. I read them in your eyes. So genius is given for no purpose but to be thrown aside like a useless toy. What a degradation of a sacred thing. How could you be such a traitor to your own order, Olive? This vacillating mood of yours makes me ashamed. I wish you would scold me out of it. Aunt Millie, you are doing me good already. Any kind of doubt makes me positively unhappy, and I really did begin to believe that I had mistaken my vocation. Olive will always be Olive, as long as she lives, returned Mildred in a grieved tone. But as the girl shrank back somewhat pained, she hastened to say, I think doubtfulness, the inward tremblings of the fibres of hope and fear, are your peculiar temptation. How would you repel any evil suggestion that came to you, Olive? Any unmistakably bad thought, I mean. I would try and shut my mind to it, not look at it, replied Olive warmly. Repel it with disdain. Well, I think I should deal with your doubts in the same way. If they will not yield after a good stand-up fight, entrench yourself in your citadel and shut the door on them. Every work of God is good, is it not? The Bible says so. Then yours must be good, since he has given you the power and delight in putting together beautiful thoughts for the pleasure and, I trust, the benefit of his creatures, and especially as you have dedicated it to his service. Would if, after all, you are right, she continued presently, and if it be not the very highest work, can you not be among the little ones that do his will? Will not this present duty and care for your father and the small daily charities that lie on your threshold suffice until a more direct call be given to you? It may come. I do not say it will not, Olive, but I am sure that the present work is your duty now. You have lifted a burden off me, returned Olive gratefully, and there was something in the clear shining of her eyes that echoed the truth of her words. It was not that I loved my work less, but that I tried not to love it. I like what you said, Aunt Millie, about being one of his little ones. Into chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Harriet's Choice. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Harriet's Choice by Rosa Nouchette Carey. Chapter 33. Yes, someone came and rested there beside me, speaking words I never thought would bless such a loveless life. I longed to hide me, feasting lonely on my happiness, but the voice I heard pleaded for a word, till I gave my whispered answer, yes. Yes, that little word, so calmly spoken, changed all life for me, my own, my own. All the cold grey spell I saw unbroken, all the twilight days seemed past and gone, and how warm and bright, in the ruddy light, pleasant June days of the future shone. Helen Marion Burnside. It was with mingled feelings of pleasure and regret that Mildred saw the grey walls of the vicarage again. It was harder than she imagined to say goodbye to Roy, knowing that she would not see him again until the summer, but her position as nurse had long become a sinecure. The place was now rightfully usurped by his young betrothed. The sea breezes had already proved so beneficial to his health that it was judged that he might safely be permitted at the end of another month to resume work in the old studio, by which time idleness and love-making might be expected to lose their novelty, and Mildred hoped that Polly would settle down happily with the others when her good sense should be convinced that an early marriage would be prejudicial to Roy's interest. It was very strange to find Chris the only welcoming home presence. Chris in office was a highly ludicrous idea. She had taken advantage of her 3 days' housekeeping to introduce striking reforms in the ménage, against which Nan had stormed and threatened in vain. The housemaid looked harassed, and the parlour maid on the eve of giving warning. The little figure with the tousle curls and holland apron and rattling keys, depending from the steel chatelaine, looked oddly picturesque in the house porch as the travellers drove up. When Mr. Marsden came in after evensong to inquire after their well-being, and Richard insisted on his remaining to tea, Chris looked mightily haughty and put on her eyeglasses and presided at the head of the table in a majestic way that tried her aunt's gravity. The big young man, as she still phrased Hugh Marsden, was never likely to be a favourite with Chris, but she thawed presently under Mildred's genial influence. No one knew so well how to bend the prickles and draw out the wholesome sweetness that lay behind. By the end of the 3rd cup, Chris was able to remember perfectly that Mr. Marsden did not take sugar, and could pass his cup without a glacial stare or a tendency to imitate the swelling and ruffling out of a dignified robin. At the end of the evening, Mildred, who had by that time grown a little weary and silent, heard the footstep in the lobby for which she had been unconsciously listening for the last 2 hours. "Here comes Dr. John at last," observed Richard, in strange echo of her thought. "I expected he would have met us at the station, but I suppose he was called away as usual." Dr. Heriot gave no clue to his absence. He shook hands very quietly with Mildred, and hoped that she was not tired, and then turned to Richard for news of the invalid, and when that topic was exhausted, seemed disposed to relapse into a brown study, from which Mildred curiously did not care to wake him. She was quite content to see him sitting there in his old place, playing absently with her paper knife, and dropping a word here and there, but oftener listening to the young men's conversation. Hugh was eagerly discussing the Bloemfontein question. He and Richard had been warmly debating the subject for the last hour. Richard was sympathetic, but he had a notion his friend was throwing himself away. "We don't want to lose such men as you out of England, Marsden. That's the fact. I've always looked upon you as just the sort of hard worker for a parish at the east end of London. Look at our city Arabs. It strikes me there is room for missionary work there. Not but what South Africa has a demand on us too." "When a man feels he has a call, there is nothing more to be said," replied Hugh, striking himself energetically on his broad chest, and speaking in his most powerful bass. "One has something to give up, of course. All colonial careers involve a degree of hardship and self-sacrifice. Not that I agree with your sister in thinking either the one or the other point to the right decision. Because we may consider it our duty to undertake a pilgrimage, it does not follow we need have pebbles or peas in our shoes, or that the stoniest road is the most direct. Of course not. We don't need these by-laws to guide us. There's plenty of hardship everywhere, and I hope no amount would frighten me from any work I undertake conscientiously. It may be pleasanter to remain in England. I'm rather of your opinion myself, but all the same, when a man feels he has a call, I should be the last to dissuade him from it. I only want you to look at the case in all its bearing. I believe, after all, you are right, and that I should do the same in your place." "One ought never to decide too hastily for fear of regretting it afterwards," put in Dr. Heriot. Mildred gave him a half-veiled glance. Why was he so quiet and abstracted, she wondered. Another time he would have entered it with animation into the subject, but now some grave thought sealed his lips. Could it be that Polly's decision had had more effect on him than he had chosen to avow, that he felt lonely and out of spirits? She watched timidly for some opportunity of testing her fears. She was almost sure that he was dull or troubled about something. "Some people are so afraid of deciding wrong that they seldom arrive at any decision at all," returned Hugh, with one of his great laughs. "All the same, over haste brings early repentance," returned Dr. Heriot, a little bitterly, as he rose. "Are you going?" asked Mildred, feeling disappointed by the shortness of his visit. "I am poor company tonight," he returned hastily. "I'm in no mood for general talk. I dare say I shall see you sometime tomorrow. By the by, how is it Polly has never answered my last letter?" "She has sent 100 apologies. I assure you she is thoroughly ashamed of herself, but Roy is such a tyrant, the child is not an hour to herself." A smile broke over his face. "I suppose not. It must be very amusing to watch them. Roy runs a chance of being completely spoiled." But this Mildred would not allow. She went to bed feeling dissatisfied with herself for her dissatisfaction. After all, what did she expect? He had behaved just as any other man would have behaved in his position. He had been perfectly kind and friendly, had questioned her about her health, and had spoken of the length of her journey with a proper amount of sympathy. It must have been some fancy of hers that he had evaded her eyes. After all, what right had she to meddle with his moods, or to be uneasy because of his uneasiness? Was not this the future she had planned? a foretaste of the long evenings when the gray-haired friend should quietly sit beside her, either speaking or silent, according to his will. Mildred scolded herself into quietness before she slept. After all, there was comfort in the thought of seeing him the next day, but this hope was doomed to be frustrated. Dr. Heriot did not make his appearance. He sent an excuse by Richard, whom he carried off with him to Nateby and Winton. An old college friend was coming to dine with him, and Richard and Hugh Marsden were invited to meet him. Mildred found her tete-a-tete evening with Chris somewhat harassing, and would have gladly taken refuge in silence and a book, but Chris had begged so hard to read a portion of the translation of a Greek play on which he was engaged that it was impossible to refuse, and a noisy hour of declamation and uncertain utterance, owing to the illegibility of the manuscript and the screeching remonstrances of Fritter my wig, whose rightful rest was invaded, soon added the discomfort of a nervous headache to Mildred's other pains and penalties, and when Chris, flushed and panting, had arrived at the last blotted page, she had hardly fortitude enough to give the work all the praise it merited. The quiet of her own room was blissful by comparison, though it brought with it a fresh impulse of tormenting thoughts. Why was it that, with all her strength of will, she had made so little progress? That the man was still so dangerously dear to her, that even without a single hope to feed her, he should still be the sum and substance of her thoughts, that all else should seem as nothing in comparison with his happiness and peace of mind. That he was far from peace she knew. Her first look at him had assured her of that, and the knowledge that it was so had wrought in her this strange restlessness. Would he ever bring himself to speak to her of this fresh blank in his existence? If it should be so, she would bid him go away for a little time. In some way his life was too monotonous for him. He must seek fresh interests for himself. The vicarage must no longer enclose his only friends. He had often spoken to her of his love for travel, and had more than once hinted at a desire to revisit the continent. Why should she not persuade him that a holiday lay within the margin of his duty? She would willingly endure his absence, if he would only come back brighter and fresher for his work. Fate had, however, decreed that Mildred's patience should be sorely tested, for though she looked eagerly for his coming all the next day, the opportunity for which she longed did not arrive. Dr. Heriot still held aloof, and the word in season could not be spoken. The following day was Sunday, but even then things were hardly more satisfactory. A brief handshake in the porch after evening service, and an inquiry after Roy, was all that passed between them. "He is beyond any poor comfort that I can give him," thought Mildred sorrowfully, as she groped her way through the dark churchyard paths. "He looks worn and harassed, but he means to keep his trouble to himself. I will try to put it all out of my head. It ought to be nothing to me what he feels or suffers." And she lay awake all night trying to put this prudent resolve into execution. The next afternoon she walked over to Nateby to look up some of her old Sunday scholars. It was a mild, wintry afternoon. A grey haziness pervaded everything. As she passed the bridge she lingered for a moment to look down below, on the spot which was now so sacred to her. The sight of the rocks and foaming water made her cover her face with a mute thanksgiving. Imagination could not fail to reproduce the scene. Again she felt herself crashing amongst the cruel stones, and saw the black, sullen waters below her. "Oh, why was I saved? To what end? To what purpose?" she gasped, and then added penitently, surely not to be discontented and indulge in impossible fancies, but to devote a rescued life to the good of others. Mildred was so occupied with these painful reflections that she did not hear carriage wheels passing in the road below the bridge, and was unaware that Dr. Heriot had descended and thrown the reins to a passing lad, and was now making his way towards her. His voice in her ear drove the blood to her heart with the sudden start of surprise and pleasure. "We always seem fated to meet in this place," he laughed, feigning not to notice her embarrassment, but embarrassed himself by it. "Coop, Kernan Hole must have a secret attraction for both of us. I find myself always driving slowly over the bridge as though I were following a friend's possible funeral." "As you might have done," she returned, with a grateful glance that completed her sentence. "Shall we go down and look at it more closely?" he asked, after a moment's silence during which he had resolved some thought in his mind. I have an odd notion that seeing it again may lay the ghost of an uneasy dream that always haunts me. After a harder day's work than usual, this scene is sure to recur to me at night. Sometimes I have to leave you there. You have floated so far out of my reach. With a meaning movement of his hand, Mildred shuddered. Shall we come? That is, if you do not much dislike the idea. And as Mildred saw no reason for refusing, she overcame her feelings of reluctance and followed him through the little gate and down the steep steps beyond which lay the uneven masses of grey brockram. There he waited for her with outstretched hand. You need not think that I shall trust you to your own care again, he said, with rather a whimsical smile, but as he felt the trembling that ran through hers, it vanished, and he became unusually grave. In another moment he checked her abruptly and almost peremptorily. We will not go any farther. Your hand is not steady enough. You are nervous. Mildred in vain assured him to the contrary. He insisted that she should sit down for a few moments, and in spite of her protestations took off his greatcoat and spread it on the rock. I'm warm, far too warm, he asserted, when he saw her looks of uneasiness. This spot is so sheltered, and he stood by her and lifted his hat, as though the cool air refreshed him. Do you remember our conversation on the other side of the bridge? He asked presently, turning to her. Mildred flushed with sudden pain. Too well she remembered it, and the long night of struggle and well-nigh despair that had followed it. I wonder what you thought of me. You were very quiet, very sweet-voiced in your sympathy, but I fancied your eyes had a distrustful gleam in them. They seemed to doubt the wisdom of my choice. Mildred, with a quick touch of passion in his voice, such as she had never heard before, what a fool you must have thought me. Dr. Heriot, how can you say such things? But her heart beat faster. He had called her Mildred again. Because I must and will say them. A man must call himself names when he has made such a pitiful thing of life. Look at my marrying Margaret, a mistake from beginning to end, and yet I must needs compass a second piece of folly. There, I think you are too hard on yourself. What right had I, at my age, or rather with my experience and knowledge of myself, to think I could make a young girl happy, knowing as I ought to have known that her endearing ways could not win her an entrance into the deepest part of my nature, that would have been closed forever, speaking in a suppressed voice. It was a mistake for which no one could blame you, Polly least of all, she returned, eager to soothe this wounded susceptibility. Dear Polly, it was her little fingers that set me free, that set both of us free. Coop Kernan Hole would have taught me its lesson too late but for her. What do you mean? Asked Mildred, startled, and trying to get a glimpse of his face. But he had turned it from her. Possibly the uncontrolled muscles and the flash of the eye might have warned her without a word. What has it taught you? She repeated, feeling she must get to the bottom of this mystery, whatever it might cost her. That it was not Polly whom I loved, he returned in a suppressed voice, but another whom I might have lost, whom Coop Kernan Hole might have snatched from me. Did you know this, Mildred? No, she faltered. I do not believe it now. She might have added, if breath had not failed her, in her exceeding astonishment. To think such words had blessed her ear. It was impossible. Oh, it was impossible. She must hear more. I'm doubly thankful to it, he repeated, stooping over her as she sat, that the fall might not drown his voice. Its dark waters are henceforth glorified to me. Never till that day did I know what you were to me, what a blank my life would be to me without you. It has come to this, that I cannot live without you, Mildred, that you are to me what no other woman, not even Margaret, not even my poor wife, has been to me. She buried her face in her trembling hands. Not even to him could she speak until the pent-up feelings in her heart had resolved themselves into an inward cry, My God, for these words, I thank thee. He watched her anxiously as though in doubt of her emotion. Love was making him timid. After all, could he have misunderstood her words? Do not speak to me yet. I do not ask it. I do not expect it, he said, touching her hand to make her look at him. You shall give me your answer when you like. Tomorrow, a week hence, you shall have time to think of it. By and by I must know what you have for me in return, and whether my blindness and mistake have alienated you, but I will not ask it now." He moved from her a few steps and came hurriedly back, but Mildred, still pale from uncontrollable feeling, would not raise her eyes. "I may be wrong in thinking you cared for me a little. Do you remember what you said? John saved me. Mildred, I do not deserve it. I've brought it all on myself, and I will try and be patient. But when you can come to me and say, 'John, I love you. I will be your wife,' you will remove a mountain load of doubt and uncertainty. Ah, Mildred, Mildred, will you ever be able to say it?" His emotion, his sensitive doubts had overmastered him. He was as deadly pale as the woman he wooed. Again he turned away, but this time she stopped him. "Why need you wait? You must know I—" But here the soft voice wavered and broke down. But he had heard enough. "What must I know? That you love me?" "Yes," was all her answer, but she raised her eyes and looked at him, and he knew then that the great loneliness of his life was gone for ever. And Mildred, what were her thoughts as she sat with her lover beside her, looking down at the sunless pool before them, here where she had grappled with death? The crowning glory of her life was given to her. The gray, colorless hues had faded out of existence. The happiness for which she had not dared to ask, which the humble creature had not whispered even in her prayers, had come to her, steeping her soul with wondrous content and gratitude. And out of her happiness came a great calm. For a little while neither of them spoke much, but the full understanding of that sacred silence lay like a pure veil between them. They were neither young. Both had known the mystery of suffering. The man held in his heart a dreary past, and Mildred's early life had been passed in patient waiting. But what exuberance of youthful joy could equal the quietude of their entire satisfaction? "Mildred, it seems to me that I must have loved you unconsciously through it all," he said presently, when their stillness had spent itself. "Somehow you always rested me. It had grown a necessity with me to come and tell you my troubles. The very sound of your voice soothed me." One of her beautiful smiles answered him. She knew he was right, and she had been more to him than he had guessed. Had not this consciousness added the bitterest ingredient to her misery, the knowledge that he was deceiving himself, that no one could give him what was in her power to give? "But I never thought it possible until lately that you could care enough for me," he continued. "You seemed so calm, so beyond this sort of earthly passion. Ah, Mildred," half gravely, half caressingly, "how could you mislead me so? All my efforts to break down that quiet reserve seemed in vain." "I thought it right. How could I guess it would ever come to this?" she answered, blushing. "I can hardly believe it now, but the answer to this was so full and satisfactory that Mildred's last lingering doubt was dispelled for ever." It was late in the afternoon when they parted at the vicarage gate. The dark figure in the wintry porch escaped their observation in the twilight, and so the last goodbye fell on Ethel Trelawney's astonished ear. "It is not goodbye after all, Mildred. I shall see you again this evening," in Dr. Heriot's voice. "Take care of yourself, my dearest, until then." And the long hand clasp that followed his words spoke volumes. When Mildred entered the drawing-room, she gave a little start at the sight of Ethel. The girl held out her hand to her with a strange smile. "Mildred, I was there and heard it. What he called you, I mean, darling. Darling, I'm so glad," breaking off with a half-sob, and suddenly closing her in her arms. For a moment Mildred seemed embarrassed. "Dear Ethel, what do you mean? What could you have heard?" "That he called you by your name. I heard his voice. It was quite enough. It told me everything, and then I closed the door. Oh, Mildred, to think he has come to an end of his blindness, and that he loves you at last." "Yes, does it not seem wonderful?" returned Mildred simply. Her fair face was still a little flushed. Her eyes were soft and radiant. In her happiness she looked almost lovely. Ethel knelt down beside her in a little effusion of girlish worship and sympathy. "Did he tell you how beautiful you are, Mildred?" No, you shall let me talk what nonsense I like tonight. I do not know when I have felt so happy. Does Richard know? No one knows. Am I the first to wish you joy then, Mildred? I never was so glad about anything before. I could sing aloud in my gladness all the way from here to Kirkleatham. Dear Ethel, this is so like you. Do think of the misery of mind you have both caused me, and now that it has come all right at last. Is he very penitent, Mildred? He is very happy, she replied, smiling over the girl's enthusiasm. How sweetly calm you look. I should not feel so in your place. I should be pining for my lost liberty, I verily believe. How long have you understood each other? Ever since Roy and Polly have come to their senses? No, indeed, only this afternoon. Only this afternoon? Incredulously. Yes, but it seems ages ago already. Ethel, you must not mind if I cannot talk much about this. It is all so new, you see. Ah, I understand. I knew how pleased you would be. You always appreciated him so. At one time I could have sooner believed you the object of his choice, till you assured me otherwise, smoothing the wavy ripples of hair over Ethel's white forehead. Women do not often marry their heroes. Dr. Harriot was my hero, laughed the girl. I chose you for him the first day I saw you, when you came to meet me, looking so graceful in your deep mourning. Your face and mild eyes haunted me, Mildred. I believe I fell in love with you then. Hush, here comes Richard, interrupted Mildred softly, and Ethel instantly became grave and rose to her feet. But for once he hardly seemed to see her. Aunt Milly, my dear Aunt Milly, he exclaimed with unusual warmth, do you know what a little bird has told me? He whispered, stooping his handsome head to kiss her. Oh, Carty, do you know already? Have you met him? Yes, and he will be here presently, Aunt Milly. I don't know what we are to do without you, but all the same, Dr. John shall have you. He is the only man who is worthy of Aunt Milly. There, that will do. You have not spoken to Ethel yet. Oh, how Mildred longed to be alone with her thoughts, and yet the sound of her lover's praises were very sweet to her. He was Richard's hero as well as Ethel's, she knew, but with Richard's entrance Ethel seemed to think she must be going. It is so late now, but I will come again tomorrow. And then, as Mildred bade her good night, she said another word or two of her exceeding gladness. She would fain have declined Richard's escort, but he offered her no excuse. She found him waiting for her at the gate, and knew him too well to hope for her own way in this. She could only be on her guard and avoid any dangerous subject. You will all miss her dreadfully, she said as they crossed the market-place in full view of Dr. Harriot's house. I don't think any of you can estimate the blank her absence will leave at the vicarage. I can, for one, he replied gravely. Do you think I can easily forget what she has done for us since our mother died? But we shall not lose her. Not entirely, I mean. No, indeed. Humanly speaking, I think their chances of happiness are greater than that of anyone. I know that they are so admirably suited to each other. Aunt Milly will give him just the rest he needs. I should not be surprised if he will forget all his bitter past then. But, Richard, I want to speak to you. You have not seen my father lately. Not for months, he replied, startled at the change in her tone. All at once it took a thin, harassed note. He has decided to stand for the Kendal election, though more than one of his best friends have prophesied a certain defeat. Richard, I cannot help telling you that I dread the result. You must try not to be uneasy, he returned, with that unconscious softening in his voice that made it almost caressing. You must know by this time how useless it is to try to shake his purpose. Yes, I know that, she returned dejectedly, but all the same I feel as though he were contemplating suicide. He is throwing away time and money on a mere chimera, for they say the Radical member will be returned to a certainty if he should be defeated, pausing in some emotion. Oh, he must take his chance of that. You do not know. It will break him down entirely. He has set his heart on this thing, and it will go badly with both of us if he be disappointed. Last night it was dreadful to hear him talk. More than once he said that failure would be social death to him. It breaks my heart to see him looking so ill, and yet refusing any sympathy that one can offer him. Yes, I understand if I could only help you, he returned in a suppressed voice. No one can do that. It has to be borne, was the dreary answer, and just then the lodge gates of Kirkleatham came in sight. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Harriet's Choice. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Harriet's Choice by Rosa Nouchette Carey. Chapter 34. John Harriet's wife, whose sweet voice should be the sweetest music to his ear, awaking all the chords of harmony, whose eye should speak a language to his soul, more eloquent than all that Greece or Rome could boast of in its best and happiest days, whose smile should be his rich reward for toil, whose pure transparent cheek pressed to his would calm the fever of his troubled thoughts and woo his spirits to those fields Elysian, the paradise which strong affection guards. Bethune. And so, when her youth was past, Mildred Lambert found the great happiness of her life, and prepared herself to be a noble helpmeet to the man to whom, unconsciously, she had long given her heart. This time there were no grave looks, no dissentient voice questioning the wisdom of Dr. Harriet's choice. A sense of fitness seemed to satisfy the most fastidious taste. Neither youth nor beauty were imperative in such a case. Mildred's gentleness was the theme of every tongue. Her tender, old-fashioned ways were discovered now to be wonderfully attractive. 100 instances of her goodness and unselfishness reached her lover's ears. "Everyone seems to have fallen in love with you, Mildred," he said to her one sweet spring evening, when he had crossed the market-place for his accustomed evening visit. Mildred was alone as usual. The voices of the young people sounded from the terrace. Olive and Richard were talking together. Polly was leaning against the wall, reading a letter from Roy. The evening sun streamed through the window on Mildred's soft brown hair and grey silk, on the great bowls of golden primroses, on the gay tints of the china. A little green world lay beyond the bay window, undulating waves of grass, a clear sparkle of water, dim blue mists, and lines of shadowy hills. Mildred lifted her quiet eyes. Their smiling depths seemed to hold a question and reproof. "Everyone thinks it their duty to praise you to me," he continued, in the same amused tone. "They are determined to enlighten me about the goodness of my future wife. They do not believe how well I know that already," with a strange glistening in his eyes. "Please do not talk so, John," she whispered. "I should not like you to think too well of me, for fear I should ever disappoint you." "Do you believe that would be possible?" he asked reproachfully. Then she gave him one of her lovely smiles. "No, I do not," she returned, "simply because though we love each other, we do not believe each other perfect. You have often called me self-willed, John, and I dare say you are right." He laughed a little at that. Her quaint gentleness had often amused him. He knew he should always hear the truth from her. She would tell him of her faults over and over again, and he would listen to them gravely and pretend to believe them rather than wound her exquisite susceptibility. But to himself he declared that she had no flaw, that she was the dearest, the purest, a pearl among women. Mildred would have shrunk in positive pain and humility if she had known the extravagant standard to which he had raised her. Sometimes he would crave to know her opinion of him in return. Like many men, he was morbidly sensitive on this point, and was inclined to take blame to himself where he did not deserve it, and she would point out his errors to him in the simplest way, and so that the most delicate self-consciousness could not have been hurt. "What, all those faults, Mildred?" he would say with a pretense at a sigh. "I thought love was blind." "I could never be blind about anything that concerned you, John," she would return, in the sweetest voice possible. "Our faults will only bind us all the closer to each other. Is not that what helpmeet means?" she went on, a soft gravity stealing over her words. "That I should try to help you in everything, even against yourself. I always see faults clearest in those I love best," she finished somewhat shyly. "The last is the saving clause," he replied, with a look that made her blush. "In this case I shall have no objection to be told of my wrongdoings every day of my life. What a blessing it is that you have common sense enough for both. I'm obliged to believe what you tell me about yourself, of course, and mean to act up to my part of our contract, but at present I'm unable to perceive the most distant glimmer of a fault. John! Seriously and really, Mildred, I believe you to be as near perfection as a living woman can be, and when Dr. Heriot spoke in this tone, Mildred always gave up the argument with a sigh. But with all her self-accusations, Mildred promised to be a most submissive wife. Already she proved herself docile to a lover's slightest wish. She did not even remonstrate when Dr. Heriot pleaded with her brother and herself that an early day should be fixed for the marriage. For herself she could have wished a longer delay, but he was lonely and wanted her, and that was enough. Perhaps the decision was a little difficult when she thought of Olive, but the time once fixed, there was no hesitation. She went about her preparations with a quiet precision that made Dr. Heriot smile to himself. One would think you were planning for somebody else's wedding, not your own, he said once, when she came down to him with her face full of gentle bustle. Come and sit down a little. At least I have the right to take care of you now, you precious woman. Yes, but John, I'm so busy. I have to think for them all, you know. And Olive, poor girl, is so scared at the thought of her responsibilities. And Richard is so occupied he cannot spare me time for anything. For Richard, now in deacon's orders, was working up the parish under Hugh Marsden's supervision. Hugh had lost his mother and had finally yielded his great heart and strength to the South African mission. But there is Polly, observed Dr. Heriot. Yes, there is Polly. Until Roy comes, she returned with a smile. She is my right hand at present until he monopolizes her, but one has to think for them all and arrange things. You shall have no one but yourself to consider by and by, was his lover-like reply. Oh, John, I shall only have time then to think of you, was her quiet answer. And so one sweet June morning, when the swaths and lines of new-mown hay lay in the crofts round Kirkby Stephen, and while the little rush-bearers were weaving their crowns for St. Peter's Day, and the hedges were thick with the pink and pearly bloom of briar roses, Mildred Heriot stood leaning on her husband's arm in St. Stephen's porch. Merrily the worn old bells were pealing out. The sunlight streamed across the market-place, the churchyard paths, and the paved lanes, and the windows of the houses abutting on the churchyard were crowded with sympathizing faces, not young nor beautiful, save to those who loved her. Yet as she stood there in her soft-eyed graciousness, many owned that they had never seen a sweeter-faced bride. My wife, is this an emblem of our future life? Whispered Dr. Heriot as he led her proudly down the path, almost hidden by the roses her little scholar's hands had strewn. But Mildred's lip quivered, and the pressure of her hand on his arm only answered him. How had she deserved such happiness, the humble soul was asking herself even at this supreme moment. Under her feet lay the fast-fading roses, but above and around spread the pure arc of central blue, the everlasting arms of a father's providence about her everywhere. Before them was the grey old vicarage, now no longer her home, the soft violet hills circling round it. Above it a heavy snow-white cloud drooped heavily like a guardian angel in mid-air, roses and sunlight and God's heavenly blue. Oh, it is all so beautiful. How is one to deserve such happiness, she thought, and then it came to her that this was a free gift alone, a talent that the Father had given to be used for the Master's service, and the slight trembling passed away, and the beautiful serene eyes raised themselves to her husband's face with the meek trustfulness of old. Mildred was not too much engrossed even in her happiness to notice that Olive held somewhat aloof from her through the day. Now and then she caught a glimpse of a weary, abstracted face, just as she had finished her preparations for departure, and the travelling carriage had driven into the courtyard. She sent Ethel and Polly down on some pretext and went in search of her favourite. She found her in the lobby, sitting on the low window-seat, looking absently at the scene below her. The courtyard of the vicarage looked gay enough. The horses were champing their bits and stamping on the beck gravel. The narrow strip of daisy turf was crowded with moving figures. Polly, in her pretty bridesmaid's dress, was talking to Roy. Ethel stood near them with Richard and Hugh Marsden. Dr. Heriot was in the porch in earnest conversation with Mr. Lambert. Beyond lay the quiet churchyard, shimmering in the sunlight. The white crosses gleamed here and there. The garlands of sweet-smelling flowers still strewed the paths. Dear Olive, are you waiting for me? I wanted just to say a last word or two. And Mildred sat down beside her in her rich dress and took the girl's listless hands in hers. Promise me, my child, that you will do the best for yourself and them." "It will be your poor best after you, Aunt Millie," returned Olive, with a grateful glance at the dear face that had been her comfort so long. It touched her that even now she should be remembered. With an impulse that was rare with her, she put her arms round Mildred and laid her face on her shoulder. "Aunt Millie, I never knew till today what you were to me, to all of us." "Am I not to be Aunt Millie always, then?" For there was something ineffably sad in the girl's voice. "Yes, but we can no longer look to you for everything. We shall miss you out of our daily life. I do not mean to be selfish, Aunt Millie. I love to think of your happiness, but all the same I must feel as though something has passed out of my life." "I understand, dear. You know I never think you selfish, Olive. Now I want you to do something for me. A promise you must make me on my wedding day." A flickering smile crossed Olive's pale face. "It must not be a hard one, then." "It is one you can easily keep. Promise me to try to bear your failures hopefully. You will have many, perhaps daily ones. I'm leaving you heavy responsibilities, my poor child, but who knows, they may be blessings in disguise." An incredulous sigh answered her. "It will be your own fault if they do not prove so. When you fail, when things go wrong, think of your promise to me and be patient with yourself. Say to yourself it is only one of Olive's mistakes and she will try to do better next time. Do you understand me, my dear?" "Yes, I will try, Aunt Millie. I'm leaving you, my darling, with a confidence that nothing can shake. I do not fear your goodness to others, only to this weary self," with a light caressing touch on the girl's bowed head and shoulders. "Hitherto you have leaned on me. I've been your crutch, Olive. Now you will rely on yourself. You see, I do not make myself miserable about leaving you. I think even this is ordered for the best." "Yes, I know. How dear of you to say all this, but I must not keep you. Hark, they are calling you." Mildred rose with a blush. She knew the light, agile step on the stairs. In another moment Dr. Heriot's dark face appeared. "They are waiting, Mildred. We have not a moment to lose. You must come, my dear wife." "One moment, John," and as she folded the girl in a long embrace, she whispered, "God bless my Olive," and then suffered him to lead her away. But when the last goodbyes were said and the carriage door was closed by Richard, Mildred looked up and waved her hand towards the lobby window. She could see the white dress and dusky halo of hair, the drooping figure and tightly locked hands, but as the sound of the wheels died away in the distance, Olive hid her face in her hands and prayed with a burst of tears that the promise she had made might be faithfully kept. An hour later Richard found her still sitting there, looking spent and weary, and took her out to walk with him. The rest have all started for Bajel. We will follow them more leisurely. The air will refresh us both, Olive, stealing a glance at the reddened eyelids that told their own tale. Olive so seldom shed tears that the relief was almost a luxury to her. She felt less suppressed now. "But Ethel, where is she, Carty?" Unwilling to let him sacrifice himself for her pleasure, she little knew that Richard was carrying out Mildred's last injunctions. "I leave Olive in your care. Be good to her, Richard," she had said as he had closed the carriage door on her, and he had understood her and given her an affirmative look. "Ethel has a headache and has gone home," he replied. "She feels this as much as any of us. She did not like breaking up the party, but I saw how much she needed quiet and persuaded her. She wants you to go up there tomorrow and talk to her." "But Carty," stopping to look at him, "I'm sure you have a headache too." "So I have, and it is pretty bad, but I thought a walk would do us both good, and we might as well be miserable together, to tell you the truth," with an attempt at a laugh. "I can't stand the house without Aunt Millie, and I thought you were feeling the same." "Dear Carty, how good of you to think of me at all," returned Olive gratefully. Her brother's evident sympathy was already healing in its effects. Just now she had felt so lonely, so forlorn. It made her better to feel that he was missing Aunt Millie too. She looked up at him in her mild, affectionate way as he walked beside her. She thought, as she had often thought before, how well the straightly cut clerical garb became him, its severe simplicity suiting so well the grave young face. How handsome, how noble he must look in Ethel's eyes. "We are so used to have Aunt Millie thinking for us that it will be hard to think for ourselves," she went on presently, when they were walking down by the weir. "You will have to put up with a great deal from me, and to be very patient, though you are always that now, Carty." "Am I?" he returned, touched by her earnestness. Olive had always been loyal to him, even when he had most neglected her, and he had neglected her somewhat of late, he thought. "I will tell you what we must do, Livy. We must try to help each other, and to be more to each other than we have been. You see, Rex has Polly, but I have no one, not even Aunt Millie now. At least we cannot claim her so much now." You have Ethel, Carty. Yes, but not in the way I want, he returned, the sensitive color flitting over his face. He could never hear or speak her name unmoved. She was far more to him now than she had ever been, when he thought of her less as the youthful goddess he had adored in his boyish days than as the woman he desired to have as his wife. He no longer cast a glamour of his own devising over her image. Faulty as well as lovable he knew her to be, but all the same he craved her for his own. Not one man in 100, not one in 1,000, would make her happy, he said more than once to himself, but it is because I believe myself to be that man that I persevere. If I did not think this, I would take her at her word and go on my way. Now, as he answered Olive, a sadness crossed his face, and she saw it. Might it not be that she could help him, even here? He had talked about his trouble to Aunt Millie, she knew. Could she not win him to some confidence in herself? Here was a beginning of the work Aunt Millie had left her. Dear Carty, I should so like it if you would talk to me sometimes about Ethel, she said, hesitating, as though fearing how he would like it. I know how often it makes you unhappy. I can always see just when it is troubling you, but I never could speak of it before. Why not, Livy? Not abruptly, but questioning. One is so afraid of saying the wrong things, and then you might not have liked it, stammering in her old way. I must always like to talk of what is so dear to me, he replied gravely. I could as soon blot out my own individuality as blot out the hope of seeing Ethel, my future wife, and in that case it were strange indeed if I did not love to talk of her. Yes, and I've always felt as though it must come right in the end, interposed Olive eagerly. Her manner gives me that impression. What impression? He asked, startled by her earnestness. I can't help thinking she cares for you, though she does not know it. At least she will not allow herself to know it. I've seen her draw herself so proudly sometimes when you have left her. I'm sure she is hardening her heart against herself, Carty. A faint smile rose to his lips. Livy, who would have thought you could have said such comforting things just when I was losing heart, too? You must never do that, she returned, in an old-fashioned way that amused him, and yet reminded him somehow of Mildred. Anyone like you, Carty, ought never to lose courage. Courage, Coeur de Lion, he returned, mimicking her tone more gaily, as his spirits insensibly rose under the sisterly flattery. God bless her, she is worth waiting for. There's no other woman in the world to me. Who would have thought we should have got on this subject today, of all days in the year? But you have done me no end of good, Livy. Then I have done myself good, she returned simply, and indeed some sweet, hopeful influence seemed to have crept on her during the last half-hour. She thought how Mildred's loving sympathy would have been aroused if she could have told her how Richard and she had mutually comforted themselves in their dullness. But something still stranger to her experience happened that night before she slept. She was lying awake later than usual, pondering over the events of the day, when a stifled sound strongly resembling a sob, promptly swallowed by a simulated yawn, reached her ear. Chrissy, dear, is there anything the matter? She inquired anxiously, trying to grope her way to the huddled heap of bedclothes. No, thank you, returned Chris with dignity. What should be the matter? Good night. I believe I'm getting sleepy, with another artfully constructed yawn, which did not in the least deceive Olive. Chrissy was crying, that was clear, and Olive's sympathy was wide awake as usual, but how was she, with her clumsy, well-meaning efforts to overcome the prickles? Chris was well known to have a soul above sympathy, which she generally resented as impertinent. Nevertheless, Olive's voice grew aggravatingly soft. I thought perhaps you might feel dull about Aunt Millie, she began, hesitating. We do, and so, I don't know, I'm sure, whom you mean by your aggravating wheeze, snapped Chris, but it is very hard. A person can't have their feelings without coming down on them like a policeman and taking them in charge. Well, then, I won't say another word, Chris, returned her sister good-humoredly. But this did not mollify Chris. Speaking won't hurt a person when they are sore all over, she replied with her usual contradiction. I hate crying, of course, and it is a pity one can't enjoy a comfortable little cry without being put through one's catechism. But I do want Aunt Millie. There, finished Chris with another ominous shaking of the bedclothes, and I want her more than you do with all your mysterious wheeze. I meant Carty, replied Olive mildly, too much used to Chris's oddities to be repulsed by them. You have no idea how much he misses her, and all her nice, quiet ways. Chris stopped her ears decidedly. I don't want to hear anything about Aunt Millie. You and Richard made her a sort of golden image. It is very unkind of you, Olive, to speak about her now, when you know how horrid and disagreeable and cross, and altogether abominable I've always been to her, and here honest tears choked Chris's utterance. A warm thrill pervaded Olive's frame. Here was another piece of work left for her to do. She must gain influence over the cross-grained, warped little piece of human nature beside her. Hitherto there had been small sympathy between the sisters. Olive's dreamy susceptibilities and Chris's shrewdness had kept them apart. Chris had always made it a point of honor to contradict Olive in everything, and never until now had she ever managed to insert the thinnest wedge between Chris's bristling self-esteem and general pugnacity. "Oh, Chris," she cried almost tremblingly, in her eagerness to impart some consolation, "there's not one of us who cannot blame ourselves in some way. I'm sure I've not been as nice as I might have been to Aunt Millie." Chris shook her shoulder pettishly. "Dear me, that is so like you, Olive. You are the most funnily constructed person I ever saw, all poetry and conscience. When you are not dreaming with your eyes open, you are always reading yourself a homily." "I wish I were nice for all your sakes," replied Olive meekly, not in the least repudiating this personal attack. "Oh, as to that, you are nice enough," retorted Chris briskly. "You won't come up to Aunt Millie, so it is no use trying. But all the same, I mean to stick to you. I don't intend you to be quite drowned dead in your responsibilities. If you say a thing, however stupid it is, I shall think it my duty to back you up, so I warn you to be careful." "Dear Chris, I'm so much obliged to you," replied Olive with tears in her eyes. She perfectly understood by this somewhat vague sentence that Chris was entering into a solemn league and covenant with her, an alliance, aggressive and defensive, for all future occasions. "There is not another tolerably comfortable person in the house," grumbled Chris. "One might as well talk to a monk as to Richard. The corners of his mouth are beginning to turn down already with ultra goodness, and now he has taken to the Noah's Ark style of dress. One has no comfort in contradicting him." "Chrissy, how can you say such things? Carty has never been so dear and good in his life." "And then there are Rex and Polly," continued Chris, ignoring this interruption. "The way they talk in corners and the foolish things they say. I've made up my mind, Livy, never to be in love, not even if I marry my professor. I would be kind to him and sew on his buttons once in a way and order him nice things for dinner. But if he sent me on errands as Rex does Polly, I would just march out of the room and never see his face again. I'm so glad that no one will think of marrying you, Olive," she finished, sleepily disposing herself to rest. "Every family ought to have an old maid, and a poetical one will be just the thing." Olive smiled. She always took these sort of speeches as a matter of course. It never entered her head that any other scheme of life were possible with her. She was far too humble-minded and aware of her shortcomings to imagine that she could find favor in any man's eyes. She lay with a lightened heart long after Chris had fallen into a sweet sleep, thinking how she could do her best for the froward young creature beside her. "I've begun work in earnest today," she thought. "First Carty and now Chris. Oh, how hard! I will try not to disappoint them." Dr. Harriot had hoped to secure some 5 weeks of freedom from work, but before the month had fully elapsed, he had an urgent recall home. Richard had telegraphed to him that they were all in great anxiety about Mr. Trelawney. There had been a paralytic seizure, and his daughter was in deep distress. They had sent for a physician from Kendal, but as the case required watching, Dr. Harriot knew how urgently his presence would be desired. He went in search of his wife immediately and found her sitting in a quiet nook in the Lowood Gardens, overlooking Windermere. The book they had been reading together lay unheeded in her lap. Mildred's eyes were fixed on the shining lake and the hills, with purple shadows stealing over them. Her husband's step on the turf failed to rouse her, so engrossing was her reverie, till his hand was laid on her shoulder. "John, how you startled me. I've been looking for you everywhere, Millie, darling," he returned, sitting down beside her. "I've been watching you for ever so long. I wanted to know what other people thought of my wife, and so for once I resolved to be a disinterested spectator." "Hush, your wife does not like you to talk nonsense," but all the same Mildred blushed beautifully. "Unfortunately, she has to endure it," he replied coolly. "After all, I think people will be satisfied. You are a young-looking woman, Millie, especially since you have left off wearing grey." "As though I mind what people think," she returned, smiling, well pleased with his praise. Was it not sufficient for her that she was fair in his eyes? Dr. Harriot had a fastidious taste with regard to ladies' dress. In common with many men, he preferred rich, dark materials with a certain depth and softness of coloring, and already, with the nicest tact, she contrived to satisfy him Mildred was beginning to lose the old-fashioned staidness and precision that had once marked her style. Others besides her husband thought the quiet, restful face had a certain beauty of its own. And he, there were some words written by the wise king of old which often rose to his lips as he looked at her. The heart of her husband does safely trust in her. She will do him good and not evil all the days of her life. How had it ever come that he had won for himself this blessing? There were times when he almost felt abashed before the purity and goodness of this woman, the simplicity and truthfulness of her words, the meekness with which she ever obeyed him. If I can only be worthy of my Mildred's love, if I can be what she thinks me, he often said to himself, as he sat beside her now, a feeling of regret crossed him that this should be their last evening in this sweet place. Shall you be very much disappointed, my wife, his favorite name for her, if we return home a few days earlier than we planned? She looked up quickly. Disappointed to go home, and with you, John? But why? Is there anything the matter? Not at the vicarage, but Mr. Trelawney is very ill, and Richard has telegraphed for me. What do you say, Mildred? Then we must go at once. Poor Ethel, of course she will want you. She always had such faith in you. Dr. Strong is no favourite at Kirkleatham. Yes, I think we ought to go, he returned slowly. You will be a comfort to the poor girl, and of course I must be at my post. I am only so sorry our pleasant trip must end. Yes, and it was doing you so much good, she replied, looking fondly at the dark face, now no longer thin and wan. I should have liked you to have had another week's rest before you began work. Never mind, he returned cheerfully. We will not waste this lovely evening with regrets. Where are your wraps, Mildred? I mean to fetch them and row you on the lake. There will be a glorious moon this evening. The next night, as Richard crossed the market-place on his way from Kirkleatham, he saw lights in the window of the low grey house beside the bank, and the next minute Dr. Heriot came out, swinging the gate behind him. Richard sprang to meet him. My telegram reached you then at Windermere. I'm so thankful you have come. Where is Aunt Millie? There, motioning to the house. Do you think I should leave my wife behind me? Let me hear a little about things, Richard. Are you going my way? To Kirkleatham, I mean. Yes, I will turn back with you. I've been up there most of the time. He seems to like me, and no one else can lift him. It seemed hard breaking into your holiday, Dr. Hurd, but what could I do? We are sure he dislikes Dr. Strong, and then Ethel seemed so wretched. Poor girl, the sudden seizure must have terrified her. Oh, I must tell you about that. I promised her I would. You see, he has taken this affair of the election too much to heart. Everyone told him he would fail, and he did not believe them. In his obstinacy, he has squandered large sums of money, and she believes this to be preying on his mind. That and the disappointment. As to that, his state was pitiable. He came back from Kendal looking as ill as possible and full of bitterness against her. She has no want of courage, but she owned she was almost terrified when she looked at him. She does not say much, but one can tell what she has been through. Dr. Heriot nodded. Too well he understood the state of the case. Mr. Trelawney's paroxysms of temper had latterly become almost uncontrollable. He parted from her in anger, his last words being that she had ruined her father, and then he went up to his dressing-room. Shortly after, a servant in an adjoining room heard a heavy fall and alarmed the household. They found him lying speechless and unable to move. Ethel says when they had laid him on his bed and he had recovered consciousness a little, his eyes followed her with a frightened, questioning look that went to her heart, and which no soothing on her part could remove. The whole of the right side is affected, and though he has recovered speech, the articulation is very imperfect, impossible to understand at present, which makes it very distressing. Poor Miss Trelawney, I fear she has sad work before her. She looks wretchedly ill over it, but what can one expect from such a shock? She shows admirable self-command in the sick-room. She only breaks down when she is away from him. I'm so glad she will have Aunt Millie. Now I must go back, as Marsden is away, and I have to copy some papers for my father. I should go back in a couple of hours to take the first share of the night's nursing. You will find me there, was Dr. Heriot's reply, as they shook hands and parted. End of chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of Harriet's Choice. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Olive's decision. Be good, sweet maid, and let who can be clever. Do lovely things, not dream them, all day long, and so make life, death, and that vast forever One Grand Sweet Song by Charles Kingsley. Ethel Trelawney had long felt as though some crisis in her life were impending. To her it seemed impossible that the unnatural state of things between her father and herself could any longer continue. Something must occur to break the hideous monotony and constraint of those slowly revolving weeks and months. Latterly there had come to her that strange listening feeling to which some peculiar and sensitive temperaments are subject, when in the silence they can distinctly hear the muffled footfall of approaching sorrow. Yet what sorrow could be more terrible than this estrangement, this death of a father's love, this chill cloud of distrust that had risen up between them? And yet when the blow fell, filial instinct woke up in the girl's soul, all the stronger for its repression. There were times during those first 48 hours when she would gladly have laid down her own life, if she could have restored power to those fettered limbs, and peace to that troubled brain. Oh, if she could only have blotted out those last cruel words, if they would cease to ring in her ears. She had met him almost timidly, knowing how heavily the bitterness of his failure would lie upon him. "Papa, I fear things have not gone well with you," she had said, and there had been a caressing, almost a pitying chord in her voice as she spoke. "How should things go well with me when my own child opposes my interest?" he had answered gloomily. "I have wasted time and substance. I have fooled myself in the eyes of other men, and now I must hide my head in this obscurity which has grown so hateful to me. And it's all your fault, Ethel." "Papa, listen to me," she pleaded. "Ambition is not everything. Why have you set your heart on this thing? It is embittering your life and mine. Other men have been disappointed, and it has not gone so very hard with them. Why will you not let yourself be comforted?" "There is no comfort for me," he had replied, and his face had been very old and haggard as he spoke. It were far better that she had not spoken. Her words, few and gentle as they were, only added to the fuel of his discontent. He had meant to shut himself up in his sullenness and make no sign, but she had intercepted his retreat and brought down the vials on her devoted head. Could she ever forget the angry storm that followed? Surely he must have been beside himself to have spoken such words. How was it that she had been accused of jilting Mr. Cathcart, of refusing his renewed overtures merely from obstinacy and the desire of opposition, that she should hear herself branded as her father's worst enemy? "You and your pride have done for me," he said, lashing himself up to a fresh fury with the remembrance of past mortification. "You have taken from me all that would make life desirable. You have been a bad daughter to me, Ethel. You've spoiled the work of a lifetime." "Papa, Papa, I've only acted rightly. How could I have done this evil thing, even for your sake?" she had cried, but he had not listened to her. "You have jilted the man you fancied out of pride, and now the mischief will lie on your own head," he had answered angrily, and then he had turned to leave the room. Half an hour afterwards the heavy thud of a fall had been heard, and the man had come to her with a white face to summon her to her father's bedside. She knew then what had come upon them. At the first sight of that motionless figure, speechless, inert, struck down with unerring force in the very prime and strength of life, she knew how it would be with them both. "Oh, my dear, forgive me," she had cried, falling on her knees beside the bed and raining tears over the rigid hands. And yet what was there to forgive? Was it not rather she who had been sinned against? What words were those the paralyzed tongue refused to speak? What was the meaning of those awful questioning eyes that rested on her day and night when partial consciousness returned? Could it be that he would have entreated her forgiveness? "Papa, Papa, do not look so," she would say in a voice that went to Richard's heart. "Don't you know me? I'm Ethel, your only own child. I will love you and take care of you, Papa. Do you hear me, dear? There's nothing to forgive, nothing. During the strain of those first terrible days, Richard was everything to her. Without him she would literally have sunk under her misery. "Oh, Richard, have I killed my father? Am I his murderess?" she cried once almost hysterically when they were left alone together. "Oh, poor papa, poor papa!" "Dear Ethel, you have done no wrong," he replied, taking her unresisting hand. "It's no fault of yours, dearest. You have been the truest, the most patient of daughters. He has brought it on himself." "Ah, but it was through me that this happened," she returned, shuddering through every nerve. "If I had married Mr. Cathcart he would not have lost his seat, and then he would not have fretted himself ill." "Ought we to do evil that good may come, Ethel?" replied Richard gravely. "Are children responsible for the wrongdoing of their parents? If there be sin, it lies at your father's door, not yours. It is you to forgive, not he." "Richard, how can you be so hard?" she demanded with a flash of her old spirit through her sobs, but it died away miserably. "I am not hard to him. God forbid. Am I likely to be hard to your father, Ethel, and now especially?" he said somewhat reproachfully, but speaking with the quiet decision that soothed her even then. "I cannot have you unfitting yourself for your duties by indulging these morbid ideas. No one blames you. You've done right. Another time you will be ready to acknowledge it yourself. You have enough to suffer without adding to your burden. I entreat you to banish these fancies once and for ever. Ethel, promise me you will try to do so." Yes, I know you're right," she returned, weeping bitterly, "only it breaks my heart to see him like this." "You're spent and weary," he replied gently. "Tomorrow you will look at these things in a different light. It has been such an awful shock to you, you see." And then he brought her wine, and compelled her to drink it, and with much persuasion induced her to seek an hour or two's repose before returning to the sick room. What would she have done without him, she thought, as she closed her heavy eyes. Unconsciously they seemed to have resumed their old relations towards each other. It was Richard and Ethel now. Richard's caressing manner had returned. No brother could have watched over her more devotedly, more reverently, and yet he had never loved her so well as when, all her imperiousness gone, and with her brave spirit well nigh broken, she seemed all the more dependent on his sympathy and care. But the first smile that crossed her face was for Mildred, when Dr. Ariot brought her up to Kirkalatham the first evening after their arrival. Mildred almost cried over her when she took her in her arms. The contrast to her own happiness was so great. "Oh, Ethel, Ethel," was all she could say, "my poor girl." "Yes, I am that, and much more," she returned, yielding to her friend's embrace, "utterly poor and wretched. Has Dr. Heriot told you all he feared?" "That there can be only partial recovery? Yes, I know he fears that, but then one cannot tell in these cases. You may have him still for years." "Ah, but what if he should have another stroke? I know what Dr. Heriot thinks. It is a bad case. He said so to Richard." "Poor child! It's so hard not to be able to comfort you." "No one can do that so long as I have him before my eyes in this state, Mildred. You cannot conceive what a wreck he is. No power of speech, only those inarticulate sounds." "I'm glad Carty's able to be so much with you." A sensitive colour overspread Ethel's worn face. "I do not know what I should have done without him," she returned in a low voice. "If he'd been my own brother he could not have done more for me. We fancy papa likes to have him. He's so strong and quiet, and always sees what is the right thing to be done. I found out Carty's value long ago. He was my right hand during Olive's illness." "He's everyone's right hand, I think," was the quiet answer. "He was the first to suggest telegraphing for Dr. Ariot. I could not bear breaking in upon your holiday, but it could not be helped." "Do you think we could have stayed away?" "All the same, it is a sad welcome to your new home. But you are a doctor's wife now. Mildred, if you knew what it was to me to see your dear face near me again. I'm so thankful John brought me." "Ah, but he will take you away again. I can hear his step now." "Poor girl, her work is cut out for her," observed Dr. Heriot thoughtfully as they walked homewards through the Crofts. "It'll be a sad lingering case, and I fear that the brain is greatly affected from what they tell me. He must have had a slight stroke many years ago." Poor Ethel," replied Mildred sorrowfully. "I must be with her as much as possible, but Richard seems her greatest comfort. Perhaps good may come out of evil. You see, I can guess at your thought, Milly darling." and then their talk flowed into a less sad channel. But not all Mildred's sympathy or Richard's goodness could avail to make those long weeks and months of misery otherwise than dreary. And nobly as Ethel Trelawney performed her duty, there were times when her young heart sickened and grew heavy with pain in the oppressive atmosphere of that weary sick-room. To her healthy vitality, the spectacle of her father's helplessness was simply terrible. The inertness of the fettered limbs, the indistinct utterance of the tied and faltering tongue, the confusion of the benumbed brain oppressed her like a nightmare. There were times when her pity for him was so great that she would have willingly laid down all her chances of happiness in this life if she could have restored him to the prospect of health. It was now that the real womanhood of Ethel Trelawney rose to the surface. Richard's heart ached with its fullness of love when he saw her day after day so meekly and patiently tending her afflicted father. The worn, pale face and eyes heavy with trouble and want of sleep were far more beautiful to him now. But he hid his feelings with his usual self-control. She had learned to depend upon him and trust him, and this state of things was too precious to be disturbed. Richard was his father's sole curate now. Towards the end of October, Hugh Marsden had finished his preparations and had bidden good-bye to his friends at the vicarage. Mildred, who saw him last, was struck with the change in the young man's manner. His cheerful serenity had vanished. He looked subdued, almost agitated. She was sitting at work in the little glass room. A tame canary was skimming among the flowers. Dr. HERIOT'S voice was heard cheerfully whistling from an inner room. Some late-blooming roses lay beside Mildred, her husband's morning gift. The book from which he had been reading to her was still open on the table. The little domestic picture smote the young man's heart with a dull pain. "I'm come to say good-bye, Mrs. Heriot," he said in a sadder voice than she had ever heard from him before. "And it has come to this, that I would sooner say any other word." "We shall miss you dreadfully, Mr. Marsden," replied Mildred, looking regretfully up at the plain, honest face. Hugh Marsden had always been a favourite with her, and she was loath to say good-bye to him. "Others have been kind enough to tell me so," he rejoined, twirling his shabby felt hat between his fingers. Miss Lambert, I mean, said so just now. Somehow I had hoped, but no, she has decided rightly." Mildred looked up in surprise. Incoherence was new in Hugh Marsden, but just now his clumsy eloquence seemed to have deserted him. "What has Olive decided?" she asked, with a sudden spasm of curiosity, and then she added kindly, "Sit down, Mr. Marsden. You do not seem quite yourself. All this leave-taking has tired you." But he shook his head. "I have no time. You must not tempt me, Mrs. Heriot, only you have always been so good to me that I wanted to ask you to say this for me." "What am I to say?" asked Mildred, feeling a little bewildered. He was still standing before her, twirling his hat in his big hands. His broad face flushed a little. "Tell Miss Olive that I know she's acted rightly. She always does, you know. It would be something to have such a woman as that beside one, strengthening one's hands. But of course it cannot be. She could not deviate from her duty by a hair's breadth." "I do not know if I understand you," began Mildred slowly, and groping her way to the truth. "I think you do. I think you've always understood me," returned the young man more quickly. "And you will tell her this from me. Of course one must have regrets, but it cannot be helped. Good-bye, Mrs. Heriot. 1,000 thanks for all you've done for me." And before Mildred could answer, he had wrung her hand and was halfway through the hall. An hour later Mildred stole softly down the vicarage lobby and knocked at the door of the room she had once occupied, and Olive's voice bade her enter. "Aunt Milly, I never thought it was you," she exclaimed, rising hastily from the low chair by the window. "Is Dr. Heriot with you?" "No, I left John at home. I told him that I wanted to have a little talk with you, and like a model husband he asked no questions and raised no obstacles. All the same, I expect he will follow me." "You wanted to talk to me?" returned Olive, in a questioning tone, but her sallow face flushed a little. "How strange, when I was just wishing for you too." "There must be some electric sympathy between us," replied her aunt, smiling. "Nothing could have induced me to sleep until I had seen you. Mr. Marsden wished me to give you a message from him. He was a little incoherent, but so far as I understand, he wished me to assure you that he considers yours a right decision." Olive's face brightened a little. Mildred had already detected unusual sadness on it, but her calmness was baffling. "Did he tell you to say that? How kind of him!" "He did not stop to explain himself. He was in too great a hurry, but I thought he seemed troubled. What was the decision, Olive? Has this helped you to make it?" touching reverently the open page of a Bible that lay beside her. The brown light in Olive's eyes grew steady and intense. She looked like one who had found rest in a certainty. "I have just been preaching to myself from the text, 'He that putteth his hand to the plough and looketh backward,' you know, Aunt Milly. Well, that seems to point as truly to me as it does to Mr. Marsden." "Yes, dearest," replied Mildred softly. "And now what has he said to you?" "I hardly know myself," was the low-toned answer. "I've been thinking it all over, and I cannot now understand how it was. It seems so wonderful that anyone could care enough for me," speaking to herself with a soft, bewildered smile. "Does Mr. Marsden care for you? I thought so from the first, Olive." "I suppose he does, or else he would not have said what he did. It was difficult to know his meaning at first. He was so embarrassed, and I was so slow, but we understood each other at last." "Tell me all he said, dear," pleaded Mildred. Could it be her own love story that Olive was treating so simply? There was a chord of sadness in her voice, and a film gathered over the brightness of her eyes, but there was no agitation in her manner. The deep of her soul might be touched, but the surface was calm. "There's not much to tell, Aunt Milly, but of course you may know all. We had said good-bye, and I'd spoken a word or two about his work, and how I thought it the most beautiful work that a man could do, and then he asked me if I should ever be willing to share in it." "Well?" "I did not understand him at first, as I told you, until he made his meaning more plain, and then I saw how it was, that he hoped that one day I might give myself heart and soul to the same work, that my talent, beautiful as he owned it to be, might not hinder me from such a glorious reality, the reality," and here for the first time she faltered and grew crimson, "of such work as must fall to a missionary's wife." "Olive, my dear child," exclaimed Mildred, now really startled, "did he say as much as that?" "Yes, indeed, Aunt Milly, and he asked if I could care enough for him to make such a sacrifice." "My dear, how very sudden!" "It did not seem so. I cannot make out why I was not more surprised. It came to me as though I had expected it all along. Of course I told him that I liked him better than anyone else I had seen, but that I never thought that anyone could care for me in that way, and then I told him that while my father lived nothing could induce me to leave him." "And what did he say to that?" "That he was afraid this would be my answer, but that he knew I was deciding rightly, that he had never meant to say so much, only that the last minute he could not help it, and then he begged that we might remain friends, and asked me not to forget him and his work in my prayers, and then he went away." "And for once in your life you decided without Aunt Milly?" The girl looked up quickly. "Was it wrong? You could not have counselled me to give a different answer, and even if you had," hesitating. "Oh, I could not have said otherwise. There was no conflicting duty there, Aunt Milly." "Dearest, from my heart I believe you are right. Your father could ill spare you." "I'm thankful to hear you say so. Of course," heaving a little sigh, "it was very hard seeing him go away like that, but I never doubted which was my duty for a moment. As long as papa and Cardy want me, nothing could induce me to leave them. I suppose you will tell them this, Olive?" "Oh, no, no," she replied, shrinking back. "That would spoil all. It would be to lose the fruit of the sacrifice. It might grieve them too. No, no one must know this but you and I, Aunt Milly. It must be sacred to us three. I told Mr. Marsden so." "Perhaps you're right," returned her aunt thoughtfully. "Richard thinks so highly of him he might give you no peace on the subject. When we have once made up our minds to a certain course of action, arguments are as weary as they are fruitless, and overmuch pity is good for no one. But, dear Olive, I cannot refrain from telling you how much I honour you for this decision." "Honour me, Aunt Milly?" and Olive's pale face flushed with strong emotion. "How can I help it? There are so few who really act up to their principles in this world, who, when the moment for self-sacrifice comes, are able cheerfully to count the cost and renounce the desire of their heart. Ah," she continued, "when I think of your yearning after a missionary life, and that you are giving up a woman's brightest prospect for the sake of an ailing parent, I feel that you've done a very noble thing indeed." "Hush, I do not deserve all this praise. I'm only doing my duty." True, and after all we are only unprofitable servants. I wish I had your humility, Olive. I feel as though I should be too happy sometimes if it were not for the sorrows of others. Their shadows on the sunshine. Ethel is always in my thoughts, and now you will be there too. I do not mean to be unhappy, faltered Olive. God loveth a cheerful giver. I must remember that, Aunt Milly. Perhaps, she continued more humbly, I am not fit for the work. Perhaps he might be disappointed in me, and I should only drag him down. Don't you recollect what Papa once said in one of his sermons about obstacles standing like the angel with the drawn sword before Balaam to turn us from the way? Mildred sighed. How often she had envied the childish faith which lay at the bottom of Olive's character, though hidden by the troublesome scrupulousness of a too sensitive conscience. Was the healthy growth she had noticed latterly owing to Mr. Marsden's influence, or had she really, by God's grace, trodden on the necks of her enemies? You must not be sorry about all this, continued the girl earnestly, noticing the sigh. You don't know how glad I am that Mr. Marsden cares for me. I cannot help feeling that some day it will all come right, returned Mildred. I must not think about that, was the hurried answer. Aunt Milly, please never to say or hint such a thing again. It would be wrong. It would make me restless and dissatisfied. I shall always think of him as a dear friend, but I mean to be Olive Lambert all my life. Mildred smiled and kissed her, and then consented very reluctantly to change the subject, but nevertheless she held to her opinion as firmly as Olive to hers. Mildred might well say that the sorrows of others shadowed her brightness. During the autumn and winter that followed her marriage, her affectionate heart was often oppressed by thoughts of that dreary sick-room. Her husband had predicted from the first that only partial recovery could be expected in Mr. Trelawney's case. A few months or years of helplessness was all that remained to the once lithe and active frame of the master of Kirkleatham. It was a pitiable wreck that met Richard's eyes one fine June evening in the following year, when he went up to pay his almost daily visit. They had wheeled the invalid on to the sunny terrace that he might enjoy the beautiful view. Below them lay the old grey buildings and church of Kirkby Stephen. The pigeons were sitting in rows on the tower, preparatory to roosting in one of the unoccupied rooms. Through the open door one had glimpses of the dark painted window with its fern-bordered ledge, and the gleaming javelins on the wall. A book lay on Ethel's lap, but she had long since left off turning the pages. The tale, simple as it was wearying to the invalid's oppressed brain. Her wan face brightened at the young curate's approach. "How is he?" asked Richard in a low voice as he approached her, and dropping his voice. Ethel shook her head. "He's very weary and wandering tonight, worse than usual, I fancy. Papa, Richard has come to see us. He's waiting to shake hands with you." "Richard! Ay, a good lad, returned the sick man listlessly. His voice was still painfully thick and indistinct, and his eyes had a dull look of vacancy. "You must excuse my left hand, Richard," with an attempt at his old courtliness. "The other is numb or gone to sleep. It's of no use to me at all. I always told Lambert he ought to be proud of his sons." "His thoughts are running on the boys tonight," observed Ethel in a low voice. "He keeps asking after Rupert, and just now he fancied I was my poor mother." Richard gave her a grave, pitying look, and turned to the invalid. "I'm glad to see you out this lovely evening," he said, trying gently to rouse his attention, for the thin dark face had a painful abstracted look. "Ah, it is beautiful enough," replied Mr. Trelawney absently. "I'm waiting for the boys. Have you seen them, Richard? Agatha sent them down to the river to bathe. She spoils them dreadfully. Rupert is a fine swimmer. He does everything well. He's his mother's favourite. I think Ethel is looking pale, Mr. Trelawney. Aunt Milly has sent me to fetch her for an hour, if you can spare her." "I can always spare Ethel. She's not much use to me. Girls are generally in the way. They're poor things compared with boys. Where is the child, Agatha? Tell her to make haste. We must not keep Richard waiting." "Dear papa," pleaded the girl, "you're dreaming tonight. Your poor Ethel is beside you." "Ah, to be sure," passing his hand wearily through his whitening hair. "I get confused. You're so like your mother. Ask this gentleman to wheel me in, Ethel. I'm getting tired." "Is he often like this?" asked Richard, when at last she was free to join him in the porch. The curfew bell was ringing as they walked through the dewy crofts among the tall sleeping daisies. The cool breeze fanned Ethel's hot temples. "Yes, very often," she returned in a dejected tone. "It is this that tries me so. If he would only talk to me a little as he used to do before things went wrong. But he only seems to live in the past, his wife and his boys, but it's chiefly Rupert now. And yet he seems restless without you. That is the strangest part. He seems to know me through it all. There are times when he's a little clearer, when he seems to think there's something between us, and then nothing satisfies him unless I sit beside him and hold his hand. It's so hard to hear him begging my forgiveness over and over again for some imaginary wrong he fancies he has done to me. Poor Ethel, yet he was never dearer to you than he is now." "Never," she returned, drying her eyes. "Night and day he engrosses my thoughts. I seem to have no room for anything else. Do you know, Richard, I can understand now the passionate pity mothers feel for a sick child for whom they sacrifice rest and comfort. There's nothing I would not do for papa." "Aunt Milly says your devotion to him is beautiful." Ethel's face grew paler. "You must not tell me that, Richard. You do not consider that I have to retrieve the coldness of a lifetime. After all, poor papa is right. I have not been a good daughter to him. I have been carping and disagreeable. I have presumed to sit in judgment on my own father. I have separated myself and my pursuits from his, and alienation was the result." "For which you were not wholly to blame," he replied gently, unable to hear those self-accusations unmoved. Why was she, the dearest and truest, to go heavily all her days for sins that were not her own? "No, you must not blame him," she continued beseechingly. "Is he not bearing his own punishment? Am I not bearing mine? Oh, it's dreadful." Her voice suddenly choked with strong emotion. "Bodily sufferings I could have witnessed with far less misery than I feel at the spectacle of this helplessness and mental decay. To talk to dull ears, to arrest wandering thoughts, to listen hour after hour to confused rambling, Richard, that seems harder than anything." "If he, the Master, I mean, fell under his cross, do we wonder that we at times sink under ours?" was the low, reverent answer. "Ethel, I sometimes think how wonderful it would be to turn the page of suffering in another world, and with eyes purified from earthly rheum, to spell out all the sacred meaning of the long trial that we considered so unbearable, nay, sometimes so unjust." Ethel did not trust herself to speak, but a grateful glance answered him. It was not the first time he had comforted her with words which had sunk deep into a subdued and softened heart. She was learning her lesson now, and the task was a hard one to poor passionate human flesh and blood. If what Richard said was true, she would not have a pang too many. The sorrowful moments would be numbered to her by the same Father, without whom not even a sparrow could fall to the ground. Could she not safely trust her father to him? "Richard, I'm always praying to come down from my cross," she said at last, looking up at the young clergyman with sweet, humid eyes. "And after all, he has fastened us here with his own hands. I suppose it is faith and patience for which one should ask, and not only relief." "He will give that, too, in his own good time," returned Richard solemnly, and then, as was often the case, a short silence fell between them. End of chapter 35. Read by Sandra.
Chapter 36 of Harriet's Choice. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Harriet's Choice by Rosa Nouchette Carey. Berengaria. I have led her home, my love, my only friend. There is none like her, none. And never yet so warmly ran my blood, and sweetly on and on, calming itself to the long wished for end, full to the banks, close on the promised good. None like her, none. Tennyson's Maud. 2 years had elapsed since Olive Lambert had made her noble decision, and during that time triple events had happened. Mr. Trelawney's suffering life was over. Rex had married his faithful Polly, and Dr. Heriot and Mildred had rejoiced over their firstborn son. Mr. Trelawney did not long survive the evening when Richard found him on the sunny terrace. Towards the end of the autumn there was a brief rally, a strange flicker of restless life. His confused faculties seemed striving to clear themselves. At times there was a strange dilated look in the dark eyes that were almost pitiful. He seemed unwilling to have Ethel out of his sight, even for a moment. One night he called her to him. She was standing at the window finishing some embroidery by the fading light, but at the first sound of the weak, querulous tones, she turned her cheerful face towards him, for however weary she felt, there was always a smile for him. "What is it, dear father?" For in those sad last days the holy name of father had come involuntarily to her lips. True, she had lasted little of his fatherhood, but still it was hers, her father. "Put down that tiresome work and come to me," he went on, fretfully. "You are always at work, always, as though you had your bread to earn. There is plenty to spare for you. Rupert will take care of you. You need not fear, Ethel." "No, dear, I am not afraid," she returned, coming to his side, and parting his hair with her soft fingers. How often she had kissed those gray streaks and the poor wrinkled forehead. He was an old man now, bowed and decrepit, sitting there with his lifeless arm folded to his side. But how she loved him, her poor stricken father. "No, you were always a good girl, Ethel. Are the boys asleep?" "Yes, both of them, father," leaning her cheek against his. "And your mother?" "Yes, dear." "I had a fancy I should like to hear Rupert's voice again. You remember his laugh, Ethel, so clear and ringing. Hal's was not like it. He was quiet and tame compared to Rupert. Ethel," wistfully, "it is a long time since I saw my boys." "My poor dear, a long, long time." And then she whispered almost involuntarily, "I shall go to them, but they shall not return to me." He caught the meaning partially. "Yes, we will go to them, you and I," he returned, vacantly patting her cheek as she hung over him. "Don't cry, Ethel. They are good boys, and shall have their rights. But I have not forgotten you. You have been a good daughter to me, better than I deserved. I shall tell your mother so when—" But the sentence was never finished. He had seemed drowsy after that, and she rang for the servant to wheel him into his own room. He was still heavy when she drew the curtains round him and wished him good night. He looked placid and beautiful, she thought, as she leant over him for a last kiss, but he only smiled at her and pressed her hand feebly. That smile, how she treasured it! It was still on his lips when the servant who slept in his room, surprised at his master's long rest, undrew the curtains and found him lying as they left him last night, dead. "You have been a good daughter to me, better than I deserved. I shall tell your mother so when—" "Oh, Ethel, he has told her now. Be comforted, darling," cried Mildred. when Ethel had thrown herself dry-eyed on her friend's bosom. God do so to me and mine, as you have dealt with him in his trouble. But for a long time the afflicted girl refused to be comforted. Richard was smitten with dismay when he saw her for the first time after her father's death. Her paleness, her assumed calmness, filled him with foreboding trouble. Mildred had told him she had scarcely slept or eaten since the shock of her bereavement had come upon her. She had come to him at once, and stood before him in her black dress. The touch of her hand was so cold that he had started at his clamminess. The uncomplaining sadness of her aspect brought the mist to his eyes. "Dear Ethel, it has been sudden, awfully sudden," he said at last, almost fearing to graze the edge of that dreary pause. "Ah, that it has. That afternoon we had both been sitting with him. Do you remember he had complained of weariness, and yet he would not suffer us to wheel him in? Who would have thought his weariness would have been so soon at an end?" She made no answer, only her bosom heaved a little. Yes, his weariness was over, but hers had begun. Her filial work was taken from her, and her heart was sick with the sudden void in life. For months he had been her first waking and her last sleeping thoughts. His helplessness had brought out the latest devotion of her nature, and now she was alone. "Will you let me see him?" whispered Richard, not daring to break on this sacred reserve of grief, and yet longing to speak some word of comfort to her stricken heart. And she had turned noiselessly and led him to the chamber of death. There her fortitude had given away a little, and Richard was relieved to see her quiet tears coursing slowly down her cheeks, as they stood side by side, looking on the still face with its changeless smile. "Ethel, I am glad you have allowed me to see him," he said at last. He looked so calm and peaceful, all marks of age and suffering gone. Who could have the heart to break that rest? Then the pent-up pain found utterance. "Oh, Richard, think never to have bidden him good-bye." "Did you wish him good night, dear? I thought you told me you always went to his bedside the last thing before you slept." "Yes, but I did not know," the tears flowing still more freely. "No, you only wished him good night, and bade God bless him. Well, has he not blessed him?" A sob was her only reply. "Has he not given him the blessing of peace? Is not his very seal of peace there stamped on that quiet brow? Dear Ethel, those words, 'He is not, for God took him,' always seem to me to apply so wonderfully to sudden death. You know," dropping his voice and coming more closely, "some men, good men even, have such a horror of death." He had, in a tone almost inaudible. "So I always understood. Think of the mercy shown to his weakness then, literally falling asleep. No slow approach of the enemy he feared, no deadly combat with the struggling flesh, only sleep, untroubled as a child, awaking not here, but in another world." Ethel still wept, but she felt less oppressed. No one could comfort her like Richard, not even Mildred. As the days went on, Richard felt almost embarrassed by the trust she reposed in him. Ethel, who had always been singularly unconventional in her ideas, and was still in worldly matters as simple as a child, could see no reason why Richard should not manage things wholly for her. Richard, in his perplexity, was obliged to appeal to Dr. Heriot. She is ill, and shrinks from business. She wants me to see the lawyer. Surely you can explain to her how impossible it is for me to interfere with such matters. She treats the man who aspires to be her husband exactly like her brother, continued the young man, in a vexed, shamefaced way. Dr. Heriot could hardly forbear a smile. The master of Kirkleatham had been lying in his grave for weeks, but his faithful daughter still refused to be comforted. She moped piteously. All business fretted her. A quiet talk with Mildred or Richard was all of which her harassed nerves seemed capable. "What can you expect?" he said at last. "Her long nursing has broken her down. She has a fine constitution, but the wear and tear of these months have been enough to wear out any woman. Leave her quiet for a little while to cry her heart out for her father. In the meantime, Mr. Grantham is waiting to have those papers signed, and to know if those leases are to be renewed," returned Richard impatiently. With her, his gentleness and sympathy had been unfailing, but it was not to be denied that his present position fretted him. To be treated as a brother, and to be no brother, to be the rejected suitor of an heiress, and yet to be told he was her right hand. No wonder Richard's heart was sore. He was even aggrieved with Dr. Heriot for not perceiving more quickly the difficulties of his situation. "If my father were in better health, she would go to him. She has said so more than once," he went on more quietly. "It is easy to see that she does not understand my hints, and under the present circumstances it is impossible to speak more plainly. She wanted me to see Mr. Grantham, and when I refused she looked almost hurt. Yes, I see. She must be roused to do things herself. Don't be vexed about it, Richard. It will all come right, and you cannot expect her to see things as we do. I will have a little talk with her myself. If it comes to the worst, I must constitute myself her man of business for the present." And Richard withdrew more satisfied. Things were at a low ebb just now with Richard. Ethel's heiress ship lay on him like a positive burden. The riches he despised rose up like a golden wall between him and his love. Oh, that she had been some poor orphan girl, that in her loneliness he might have taken her to his heart and his father's home. What did either he or she want with these riches? He knew her well enough to be sure how she would dread the added responsibility that would bring. How often she had said to him during the last few weeks, "Oh, Richard, it is too much. It impresses me terribly. What am I to do with it all and with myself?" And he had not answered her a word. Dr. Heriot found his task easier than he had expected. Ethel was unhappy enough to be slightly unreasonable. She felt herself aggrieved with Richard, and had misunderstood him. "I suppose he has sent you to tell me that I must rouse myself," she said. with languid displeasure, when he had unfolded his errand. He need not have troubled either himself or you. I have seen Mr. Grantham. He went away by the 2:50 train. I must say that I think you have done wisely, returned Dr. Heriot, much pleased. No one, not even Richard, has a right to interfere in these matters. The will is left so that your trustees will expect you to exert yourself. It seems a pity that you cannot refer to them. You know Mr. Malloy is dead. Yes, and Sir William still in Canada. Yet, with an honest, straightforward man like Grantham, I think you might settle things without reference to any one. Richard is only sorry his father is so ailing. No, I could not trouble Mr. Lambert. Richard has been so much about the house during your father's illness that it seems natural to refer to him. Well, he has an older head than many of us, but all the same you must understand his scruples. They have seemed to me far-fetched, but nevertheless Ethel blushed a little as she spoke. A dim sense of Dr. Heriot's meaning had been drawing on her slowly, but she was unwilling to confess it. She changed the subject somewhat hastily by asking after Mildred and the baby and loading Dr. Heriot with loving messages. Nothing more was said about Richard until the close of the visit, when Dr. Heriot somewhat incautiously mentioned him again. But, as he told Mildred afterwards, he spoke advisedly. You will not let Richard think he is misunderstood, he said, as he rose to take leave. You know he is the last one to spare himself trouble, but he feels in your position that he must do nothing to compromise you. He will not have the opportunity, she returned with brief haughtiness, and turning suddenly very crimson. But as she met Dr. Heriot's look of mild reproach, she melted. No, he is right. You are all of you quite right. I must exert myself and try and care for the things that belong to my darling father. Only I shall be so lonely, so very lonely. And she covered her face with her hands. Ethel met Richard with more than her usual kindness when she saw him next. Her sweet, deprecating glance gave the young man a sorrowful pang. You need not have sent him to see me, Richard, she said, a little sadly. I have been thoughtless and hurt you. I will trouble no one but myself now. It was not the trouble, Ethel. You must know that. He returned eagerly. I wish I had the right to help you, but his voice broke, and he dropped her hands. Perhaps he felt the time had not come to speak. Perhaps an involuntary chill seized him as he thought of the little he had to offer her. His manner was very grave, almost reserved, during the rest of the visit. Both of them were glad when a chance caller enabled Richard, without awkwardness, to take his leave. After this the young curate's visits grew rarer, and at last almost entirely ceased, and they only met at intervals at the vicarage or the Grey House, as Dr. Heriot's house was commonly called. Ethel made no complaint when she found she had lost her friend. Only Mildred noticed that she grew paler and drooped visibly. Mildred's tender heart bled for the lonely girl. Both she and her husband pleaded urgently that Ethel should leave her solitary home and come to them for a little, but Ethel remained firm in her refusal. "Your life is so perfect, so beautiful, Mildred," she said once when the latter had pressed her almost with tears in her eyes, "that I could not break in upon it with my sad face and moping ways. I should be more wretched than I am now. But at least you might have some lady with you. Such perfect loneliness is good for no one. I cannot bear to think of you living in a corner of that great house all by yourself," returned Mildred, almost vexed with her obstinacy. And indeed, the girl was very difficult to understand in those days. "I have no friends but all of you dear people," she answered, in the saddest voice possible, "and I will not trouble you. I could not tolerate a stranger for a moment, Mildred. You must not be hurt with me. You do not know. I must have my way in this." And though Mildred shook her wise head, Dr. Harriet entered more than one laughing protest against such determined self-will. They were obliged to yield. It was a strange life for so young a woman, and would have tried the strongest nerves, but the only wisdom that Ethel Trelawney showed was in not allowing herself an idle moment. The old dreaming habits were broken forever. The fastidious choice of duties altogether forgotten. Her days were chiefly devoted to her steward and tenants. Richard, returning from his parochial visits to some outlying village, often met her, mounted on his beautiful brown mare, Zoe. Sometimes she would stop and give him her slim hand, and let him pet the mare, and talk to her leaning on Zoe's glossy neck. But oftener a wave of the hand and a passing smile were her only greeting. Richard would come in stern and weary from these encounters, but never spoke of them. It was in the following spring that Roy and Polly were married. Roy had been successful and had sold another picture, and as Mr. Lambert was disposed to be liberal to his younger son, there was no fear of opposition from Polly's guardian, even if he could have resisted the pleadings of the young people. But after all, there was no actual imprudence. If Roy failed to find a continuous market for his pictures, there was still no risk of positive starvation. Mr. Lambert had been quite willing to listen to Richard's representations and to settle a moderate sum on Roy. For the present, at least, they would have enough and to spare, and the responsibility of a young wife would add a spur to Roy's genius. Richard was not behind in his generosity. Already his frugality had amassed a few hundreds, half of which he placed in Roy's hands. Roy spent a whole day in Wardour Street after that. A wagon laden with old carved furniture and wonderful bric-a-brac drew up before the Hollies. New crimson velvet curtains and a handsome carpet found their way to the old studio. Polly hardly recognized it when she first set her foot in the gorgeous apartment, and heaved a private sigh over the dear old shabby furniture. A little carved work table and a davenport of Indian wood stood in a corner appropriated to her use. A sleep-wooing couch and a softly cushioned easy chair were beside them. Polly cried a little with joy when the young husband pointed out the various contrivances for her comfort, all the pretty dresses Dr. Heriot had given her, and even Aunt Millie's thoughtful present of house linen, which now lay in the new press, with a sweet smell of lavender breathing through every fold, were as nothing compared to Roy's gifts. After all, it was an ideal wedding. There was youth, health, and good looks, with plenty of honest love and good humor. I have perfect faith in Polly's good sense, Dr. Heriot had said to his wife, when the young people had driven away. She has just the qualities Rex wants. I should not wonder if they turn out the happiest couple in the world, with the exception of ourselves, Milly darling. The wedding had taken place in June, and the time had now come around for the rush bearing. The garden of Kirk-Latham, the vicarage, and the grey house had been visited by the young band of depredators. Dr. Heriot's glass house had been rifled of the choicest blossoms. Mildred's bonny boy, still in his nurse's arms, crowed and clapped his hands at the great white Annunciation lily that his mother had chosen for him to carry. "You will not be late, John," pleaded Mildred, as she followed him to the door. According to her invariable custom, on the morning of St. Peter's Day, his wife's face was the last he saw when he quitted his home for his long day's work. At the well-known click of the gate, she would lay down her work at whatever hour it was and come smiling to meet him. "Where are you, Milly darling?" were always his first words, if she lingered a moment on her way. "You will not be later than you can help," she continued, brushing off a spot of dust on his sleeve. "You must see Arnold carry his lily, and Ethel will be there, and, blushing and laughing, you know I never can enjoy anything unless you are with me." "Fie, Milly darling, we ought to be more sensible after 2 years. We are old merry folks now, but if it were not for making my wife vain," looking at the sweet serene face so near to his own, "I might say the same. There, I must not linger if I am under orders. Goodbye, my two treasures," placing the great blue-eyed fellow in Mildred's arms. When Mildred arrived at the park under Richard's guardianship, he had undertaken to drive her and the child. They found Ethel at the old trysting place among a host of other ladies, looking sad and weary. She moved towards them, tall and shadowy, in her black dress. "I'm glad you are here," said Richard, in a low voice. "I thought the Delawares would persuade you, and you would be quiet enough at the vicarage." "I thought I ought to do honor to my godson's first appearance in public," returned Ethel, stretching out her arms to the smiling boy. Mildred and Dr. Heriot had begged Olive to fill the position of sponsor to the younger Arnold, but Olive had refused almost with tears. "I am not good enough. Do not ask me," she had pleaded, and Mildred, knowing the girl's sad humors, had transferred the request to Ethel. Her brother and Richard had stood with her. Richard had no time to say more, for already the band had struck up that heralded the approach of the little rush bearers, and he must take his place at the head of the procession with the other clergy. She saw him again in church. He came down the chancel to receive the children's gay crowns. Ethel saw a broken lily lying among them on the altar afterwards. It struck her that his face looked somewhat sterner and paler than usual. She was one of the invited guests at the vicarage. The Lamberts were this year up at the Hall, but later on in the afternoon they met in the Hall gardens. He came up at once and accosted her. "All this is jarring on you terribly," he said, with his old thoughtfulness, as he noticed her tired face. "I should be glad to go home, certainly, but I do not like to appear rude to the Delawares. The music is so noisy, and all those flitting dancers between the trees confuse one's head." "Suppose we walk a little way from them," he returned, quietly. No one but a keen observer could have read a determined purpose under that quietness of his. Ethel's worn face, her changed manners, were driving him desperate. The time had come that he would take his fate between his hands, like a man, so he told himself as they walked side by side. They had sauntered into the tree-bordered walk leading to the old summer house in the meadows. As they reached it, Ethel turned to him with a new sort of timidity in her face and voice. "I am not tired, Richard. Not very tired, I mean. I would rather go back to the others." "We will go back presently, Ethel. I want to speak to you. I must speak to you. This sort of thing cannot go on any longer." "What do you mean?" she asked, turning very pale, but not looking at him. "That we cannot go on any longer avoiding each other like this. You have avoided me very often lately, have you not, Ethel?" speaking very gently. "I do not know. You are so changed. You are not like yourself, Richard," she faltered. "How can I be like myself?" he answered, with a sudden passion in his voice that made her tremble. "How am I to forget that I am a poor curate and you your father's heiress, and that I have 50s where you have thousands? Oh, Ethel, if you were only poor," his tone sinking into pathos. "What have riches or poverty to do with it?" she asked, still averting her face from him. "Do you not see? Can you not understand?" he returned eagerly. "If you were poor, would it not make my wooing easier? I have loved you how long, Ethel? Is it 10 or 11 years? I was a boy of 14 when I loved you first, and I have never swerved from my allegiance." "Never," in a low tone. "Never. When you called me Coeur de Lion, I swore then, lad as I was, that I would one day win my Berengaria. You have been the dearest thing in life to me ever since I first saw you, and now that I should lose my courage over these pitiful riches. Oh, Ethel, it is hard, hard, just when a little hope was dawning on me that one day you might be able to return my affection. Was I wrong in that belief?" trying to obtain a glimpse of the faith now shielded by her hands. "Whatever I may feel, I know we are equals," she returned evasively. "In one sense we are not," he answered sadly. A woman ought not to come laden with riches to overwhelm her husband. I am a clergyman, a gentleman, and therefore I fear to ask you to be my wife. Was Berengaria poor? In a voice near inaudible, but he heard it, and his handsome face flushed with sudden emotion. Do you mean you're willing to be my Berengaria? Oh, Ethel, my love, this is too much. Can you really care for me enough? I have cared for you ever since you were so good to me in my trouble, she said, turning her glowing countenance, that he might read the truth of her words. But you have made me very unhappy lately, Richard. What could I do? He answered, almost incoherent with joy. I thought you were treating me like a brother, and I feared to break in upon your grief. Oh, if you knew what I have suffered. I understand, and that only made me love you all the more, she replied softly. You have been winning my heart slowly ever since that evening. You remember it, in the kitchen garden, when you almost broke my heart. I was likely to forget it. Do you think? You startled me. I had only a little love, but it has been growing ever since, Richard, with her own archness. You will not refuse to see the lawyers now? He colored slightly, and his bright look clouded. But this time Ethel did not misunderstand him. Dear Richard, you cannot hate the riches more than I do, but they must never be mentioned again between us. They must be sacred to us as my father's gift. I know you will help me to do what is right and good with them, she continued in her winning way. They are talents we must use, not abuse. You have rebuilt me, my dearest, returned Richard tenderly. It is I who have been faithless and a coward. I will accept the charge you have given me, and thank God at the same time for your noble heart. So the long desired gift had come into Richard Lambert's keeping, and the woman he had loved from boyhood had consented to be his wife. The young master of Kirk Latham ruled well and wisely, and Ethel proved a noble helpmeet. When, some years later, his father died, and he became vicar of Kirkby Stephen, the parish had reason to bless the strong heart and head, and the magnificent hands that were never weary of giving. And our vicar rivaled even the good doctor's popularity. And what of Olive and Hugh Marsden? Mildred's words had come true. There were long, lonely years before Hugh Marsden, years of incessant toil and Herculean labor, which should stoop his broad shoulders and streak his dark hair with gray, when men should speak of the noble missionary Hugh Marsden, and of the incredible work carried forward by him beyond the pale of civilization. There was no limit to his endurance, no lack of cheerfulness in his efforts. They said no labor was too great, no scheme too impractical, no possibility too remote for the energies of that arduous soul. Hugh Marsden only smiled at their praise. He was free and unfettered. He had no wife or child. Danger would touch him alone. What should hinder him from undertaking any enterprise in his master's service? But wherever he went in his lonely hours, or in his long sunshiny converse with others, he ever remained faithful to his memory of Olive. She was still to him the purest ideal of womanhood. At times her face, with its cloudy dark hair and fathomless eyes, would haunt him with strange persistence. Whole lines and passages of her poetry would return to his memory, stirring him with subtle sweetness and vague longings for home. And Olive, how it was with her during those years of home duty, so patiently, so unselfishly performed, while she achieved her modest fame and carried it so meekly. Had she any remembrance of Hugh Marsden? I remember all the more that I try to forget, she said once when Mildred had put the question to her. Now I shall try no more, for I know I cannot forget him. And again there had been that sadness in her voice, but she never spoke of him voluntarily even to Mildred, but hid in her quiet soul many a secret yearning. They were separated thousands of miles, yet his honest face and voice were often present with her, and never nearer than when she whispered prayers for the friend who had once loved her. And neither of them knew that the years would bring them together again, that one day Hugh Marsden, broken in health and craving for a sight of his native land, should be sent home on an important mission to find Olive free and unfettered and waiting for him in her brother's home. The end. End of chapter 36. End of Harriet's Choice by Rosa Nouchette Carey.